Address of President Roosevelt on the occasion of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln, Hodgenville, Kentucky, February 12, 1909, by Theodore Roosevelt. We have met here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the birth of one of the two greatest Americans, of one of the two or three greatest men of the 19th century, of one of the greatest men in the world's history. This rail splitter, this boy who passed his ungainly youth in the dire poverty of the poorest of the frontier folk, whose rise was by weary and painful labor, lived to lead his people through the burning flames of a struggle from which the nation emerged purified as by fire, born anew to a loftier life. After long years of iron effort and of failure that came more often than victory, he at last rose to the leadership of the Republic at the moment when that leadership had become the stupendous world task of the time. He grew to know greatness, but never ease. Success came to him, but never happiness, save that which springs from doing well a painful and a vital task. Power was his, but not pleasure. The furrows deepened on his brow, but his eyes were undimmed by either hate or fear. His gaunt shoulders were bowed, but his steel thews never faltered as he bore for a burden the destinies of his people. His great and tender heart shrank from giving pain, and the task allotted him was to pour out like water the lifeblood of the young men, and to feel in his every fiber the sorrow of the women. Disaster saddened but never dismayed him. As the red years of war went by, they found him ever doing his duty in the present, ever facing the future with fearless front, high of heart and dauntless of soul. Unbroken by hatred, unshaken by scorn, he worked and suffered for the people. Triumph was his at the last, and barely had he tasted it before murder found him, and the kindly, patient, fearless eyes were closed forever. As a people, we are indeed beyond measure fortunate in the characters of the two greatest of our public men, Washington and Lincoln. Widely though they differed in externals, the Virginia landed gentleman and the Kentucky backwoodsman, they were alike in essentials. They were alike in the great qualities which made each other able to render service to his nation and to all mankind, such as no other man of his generation could or did render. Each had lofty ideals, but each, in striving to attain these lofty ideals, was guided by the soundest common sense. Each possessed inflexible courage in adversity, and a soul wholly unspoiled by prosperity. Each possessed all the gentler virtues commonly exhibited by good men who lack rugged strength of character. Each possessed also all the strong qualities commonly exhibited by those towering masters of mankind who have too often shown themselves devoid of so much as the understanding of the words by which we signify the qualities of duty, of mercy, of devotion to the right, of lofty disinterestedness in battling for the good of others. There have been other men as great and other men as good, but in all the history of mankind there are no other two great men as good as these, no other two good men as great. Widely though the problems of today differ from the problems set for solution to Washington when he founded this nation, to Lincoln when he saved it and freed the slave, yet the qualities they showed in meeting these problems are exactly the same as those we should show in doing our work today. Lincoln saw into the future with a prophetic imagination, usually vouchsafed only to the poet and the seer. He had in him all the lift toward greatness of the visionary, without any of the visionary's fanaticism or egotism, without any of the visionary's narrow jealousy of the practical man, and inability to strive in practical fashion for the realization of an ideal. He had the practical man's hard common sense and willingness to adapt means to ends, but there was in him none of that morbid growth of mind and soul which blinds so many practical men to the higher things of life, No more practical man ever lived than this homely backwoods idealist, but he had nothing in common with those practical men whose consciences are warped until they fail to distinguish between good and evil, fail to understand that strength, ability, shrewdness, whether in the world of business or of politics, only serve to make their possessor a more noxious, a more evil member of the community, if they are not guided and controlled by a fine and high moral sense. We of this day must try to solve many social and industrial problems, requiring to an especial degree the combination of indomitable resolution with cool-headed sanity. We can profit by the way in which Lincoln used both these traits as he strove for reform. We can learn much of value from the very attacks which, following that course, brought upon his head, attacks alike by the extremists of revolution and by the extremists of reaction. He never wavered in devotion to his principles, in his love for the Union, and in his abhorrence of slavery. Timid and lukewarm people were always denouncing him because he was too extreme. But as a matter of fact, he never went to extremes. He worked step by step, and because of this, the extremists hated and denounced him with a fervor which now seems to us fantastic in its deification of the unreal and the impossible. At the very time when one side was holding him up as the apostle of social revolution because he was against slavery, the leading abolitionist denounced him as the slave hound of Illinois. When he was the second-time candidate for president, the majority of his opponents attacked him because of what they termed his extreme radicalism, while a minority threatened to bolt his nomination because he was not radical enough. He had continually to check those who wished to go forward too fast, at the very time that he overrode the opposition of those who wished not to go forward at all. The goal was never dim before his vision, but he picked his way cautiously, without either halt or hurry, as he strode toward it, through such a morass of difficulty that no man of less courage would have attempted it, while it would surely have overwhelmed any man of judgment less serene. Yet perhaps the most wonderful thing of all, and from the standpoint of the America of today and of the future, the most vitally important, was the extraordinary way in which Lincoln could fight valiantly against what he deemed wrong and yet preserve undiminished his love and respect for the brother from whom he differed. In the hour of a triumph that would have turned any weaker man's head, in the heat of a struggle which spurred many a good man to dreadful vindictiveness, he said truthfully that so long as he had been in his office, he had never willingly planted a thorn in any man's bosom, and besought his supporters to study the incidents of the trial through which they were passing as philosophy from which to learn wisdom, and not as wrongs to be avenged, ending with the solemn exhortation that, as the strife was over, all should reunite in a common effort to save their common country. He lived in days that were great and terrible, when brother fought against brother for what each sincerely deemed to be the right, in a contest so grim the strong men who alone can carry it through are rarely able to do justice to the deep convictions of those with whom they grapple in mortal strife. At such times men see through a glass darkly, to only the rarest and loftiest spirits it's vouchsafed that clear vision which gradually comes to all, even to the lesser, as the struggle fades into distance and wounds are forgotten, and peace creeps back to the hearts that were hurt. But to Lincoln was given this supreme vision. He did not hate the man from whom he differed. Weakness was as foreign as wickedness to his strong, gentle nature, but his courage was of a quality so high that it needed no bolstering of dark passion. He saw clearly that the same high qualities, the same courage and willingness for self-sacrifice and devotion to the right, as it was given them to see the right, belonged both to the men of the North and to the men of the South. As the years roll by, and as all of us, wherever we dwell, grow to feel an equal pride in the valor and self-devotion alike of the men who wore the blue and the men who wore the gray, so this whole nation will grow to feel a peculiar sense of pride in the man whose blood was shed for the union of his people and for the freedom of a race, the lover of his country and of all mankind, the mightiest of the mighty men who mastered the mighty days Abraham Lincoln. End of address of President Roosevelt on the occasion of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln by Theodore Roosevelt. Lincoln, a Man of Simple Habits by Alexander K. McClure. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lincoln, a Man of Simple Habits. Lincoln's habits at the White House were as simple as they were at his old home in Illinois. He never alluded to himself as president or as occupying the presidency. His office he always designated as the place. "Call me Lincoln," said he to a friend. Mr. President had become so very tiresome to him. "If you see a newsboy down the street, send him up this way," said he to a passenger as he stood waiting for the morning news at his gate. Friends cautioned him about exposing himself so openly in the midst of enemies, but he never heeded them. He frequently walked the streets at night, entirely unprotected, and felt any check upon his movements a great annoyance. He delighted to see his familiar Western friends, and he gave them always a cordial welcome. He met them on the old footing and fell at once into the accustomed habits of talk and storytelling. An old acquaintance with his wife visited Washington. Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln proposed to these friends a ride in the presidential carriage. It should be stated in advance that the two men had probably never seen each other with gloves on in their lives, unless when they were used as protection from the cold. The question of each Lincoln at the White House and his friend at the hotel was whether he should wear gloves. Of course the ladies urged gloves, but Lincoln only put his in his pocket, to be used or not according to the circumstances. When the presidential party arrived at the hotel to take in their friends, they found the gentleman, overcome by his wife's persuasions, very handsomely gloved. The moment he took his seat, he began to draw off the clinging kids, while Lincoln began to draw his on. "No, no, no," protested his friend, tugging at his gloves. "It is none of my doings. Put up your gloves, Mr. Lincoln." So the two old friends were on even and easy terms and had their ride after their old fashion. End of Lincoln, a Man of Simple Habits by Alexander K. McClure. Autobiographical Sketch by Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Autobiographical Sketch to J.W. Fell. Springfield, December 20th, 1859. J.W. Fell, Esquire. My dear Sir, herewith is a little sketch, as you requested. There is not much of it, for the reason, I suppose, that there is not much of me. If anything be made out of it, I wish it to be modest, and not to go beyond the material. If it were thought necessary to incorporate anything from any of my speeches, I suppose there would be no objection. Of course, it must not appear to have been written by myself. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln. I was born February 12, 1809, in Hardin County, Kentucky. My parents were both born in Virginia, of undistinguished families, second families, perhaps I should say. My mother, who died in my 10th year, was of a family of the name of Hanks, some of whom now reside in Adams and others in Macon County, Illinois. My paternal grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, emigrated from Rockingham County, Virginia, to Kentucky about 1781 or 1782, where a year or two later he was killed by the Indians, not in battle, but by stealth, when he was laboring to open a farm in the forest. His ancestors, who were Quakers, went to Virginia from Berks County, Pennsylvania. An effort to identify them with a New England family of the same name ended in nothing more definite than a similarity of Christian names in both families, such as Enoch, Levi, Mordecai, Solomon, Abraham, and the like. My father, at the death of his father, was but 6 years of age, and he grew up literally without education. He removed from Kentucky to what is now Spencer County, Indiana, in my 8th year. We reached our new home about the time that state came into the Union. It was a wild region, with many bears and other wild animals still in the woods. There I grew up. There were some schools, so-called, but no qualification was ever required of a teacher beyond reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of 3. If a straggler supposed to understand Latin happened to sojourn in the neighborhood, he was looked upon as a wizard. There was absolutely nothing to excite ambition for education. Of course, when I came of age, I did not know much. Still, somehow I could read, write, and cipher to the rule of 3, but that was all. I have not been to school since. The little advance I now have upon this store of education I have picked up from time to time under the pressure of necessity. I was raised to farm work, which I continued till I was 22. At 21, I came to Illinois, Macon County. Then I got to New Salem, at that time in Sangamon, now in Menard County, where I remained a year as a sort of clerk in a store. Then came the Black Hawk War, and I was elected a captain of volunteers, a success which gave me more pleasure than any I have had since. I went the campaign, was elected, ran for the legislature of the same year, 1832, and was beaten, the only time I ever have been beaten by the people. The next and 3 succeeding biennial elections I was elected to the legislature. I was not a candidate afterward. During this legislative period I had studied law, and removed to Springfield to practice it. In 1846 I was once elected to the lower house of Congress, was not a candidate for re-election. From 1849 to 1854, both inclusive, practiced law more assiduously than ever before. Always a Whig in politics, and generally on the Whig electoral tickets, making active canvasses. I was losing interest in politics when the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused me again. What I have done since then is pretty well known. If any personal description of me is thought desirable, it may be said I am in height 6 feet 4 inches nearly, lean in flesh, weighing on an average 180 pounds, dark complexion, with coarse black hair and gray eyes. No other marks or brands recollected. Yours truly, A. Lincoln. End of Autobiographical Sketch by Abraham Lincoln.
Five-Star Mother, to Mrs. Bixby, by Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Five-Star Mother, to Mrs. Bixby. Executive Mansion, Washington, November 21, 1864. Mrs. Bixby, Boston, Massachusetts. Dear Madam, I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement, and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, Abraham Lincoln. End of Five-Star Mother to Mrs. Bixby. Read by Nick Autorina, Woodstock, Georgia, May 24th, 2026.
Broke his back. Sad accident to an inmate of the Soldiers' Home. From the Los Angeles Times, September 16th, 1893. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Broke his back. Sad accident to an inmate of the Soldiers' Home. Fell from a streetcar, was run over, and almost instantly killed. The facts brought out by the coroner's inquest. Augustus T. Wilson, a member of the Soldiers' Home, met with a sudden and tragic death late Thursday evening, about halfway between Santa Monica and the Soldiers' Home. He had been at Santa Monica during the evening with some fellow soldiers, a number of whom, including himself, drank more liquor than was good for them. About 10:30 o'clock, all boarded the car to return to the home. There were over 30 passengers aboard, filling the little car to its utmost capacity. Wilson, being unable to obtain a seat, took a position standing on the footboard at the extreme forward end of the car. There seemed to be a great deal of hilarity among the passengers, and some were singing old war songs. However, everything was peaceful, and there was no animosity displayed. From the statements of the driver and others, it is evident that Wilson, while not drunk, was more or less under the influence of liquor. While the car was proceeding on its way, he became involved in an argument with a fellow passenger, and, hanging on with one hand, he emphasized his side of the argument with the other. Suddenly the car struck an obstruction and was quickly brought to a stop. It was then ascertained that Wilson had fallen off, and the front wheels of the car had run over him. He was quickly picked up and laid on one of the seats, but hardly had this been done when he expired with a groan of pain. The body was conveyed to the home by the same conveyance that had caused his death, when Surgeon Pruitt made an examination. It was then ascertained that several ribs on each side of the man's body had been broken, and his spinal column fractured, besides other cuts and contusions. Coroner Cates was summoned, and Friday afternoon an inquest was held on the remains. The facts as above recited were substantially brought out. There was no one who testified as to witnessing the unfortunate man's immediate fall, although he was seen gesticulating perhaps a minute before the car stopped. The jury, after a short deliberation, returned a verdict that the man came to his death by falling underneath a car of the Santa Monica and Soldiers' Home Railroad on which he was riding, and that his death was accidental. Wilson had been a member of the home for several years, and since April 1892 had been an inmate of the hospital, being engaged at the time of his death as a waiter upon one of the tables there. He was about 55 years of age, and during the rebellion served in Company G, 146th Illinois Infantry. His funeral will occur this afternoon. End of Broke his back. Sad accident to an inmate of the Soldiers' Home. From the Los Angeles Times, September 16th, 1893. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.
A Cycle of 18 Years in the Seasons of Britain by Luke Howard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. A Cycle of 18 Years in the Seasons of Britain, deduced from meteorological observations made at Ackworth in the West Riding of Yorkshire, from 1824 to 1841, compared with others before made for a like period ending with 1823, in the vicinity of London, by Luke Howard, Esquire, FRS. Figure 1 is displayed on the previous page. Cycle of yearly rain and mean temperature, latitude 53 degrees 39 north. To the Right Honourable the Earl Fitzwilliam. My Lord, Your Lordship's extended interest in the agriculture of the district to which these observations more immediately apply, and your known personal attention to the subject treated, might suffice, with more public grounds, to justify my freedom in inscribing to you this attempt to make useful and important deductions from a series of tables of the weather. But I have a higher plea. Your Lordship is a patriot, one who knows how to find, in the well-being of a whole community, his own peculiar interest and happiness, and this little work claiming also to stand, if on any public ground of merit, on its usefulness to the most useful portion of the community, I may reasonably hope it will meet with your Lordship's approval and patronage. I am, my Lord, your Lordship's faithful friend, the author. Tottenham, March 31st, 1842. A cycle of 18 years in the seasons of Britain, etc. The fact of a periodical revolution, bringing alternate warmth and coldness through successive trains of seasons in a variable climate, is now ascertained beyond controversy, and it becomes in consequence an important object to ascertain the nature and extent of these changes and their effects on our agriculture, especially that we may the better avail ourselves of the favourable and provide against the adverse. In my account of the climate of London, first printed in 1820, I gave a view of these changes on the basis, which my observations then seemed to present, of alternate periods of 7 and 10 years, the former ascending, the latter descending in the scale of heat. I then omitted, from appearances, the probability of spaces between these successive periods not agreeing with the rule above mentioned, and answering to the intercalations of an imperfect calendar. Having since pursued the subject further, I find these spaces, or interposed years, to be necessary parts of the scheme at large, which now resolves itself into a cycle of 18 years, in which our seasons appear to pass through their extreme changes in respect of warmth and cold, of wet and dryness. I have given an account already to the Royal Society of my views on this subject, as regards the seasons near London, and what relates to the periodical variations of the barometer from year to year in this neighbourhood is inserted in the Transactions. My present object is to bring in confirmation of these views the facts of a new period observed for a new locality, and that differing so considerably in latitude from the former as to justify the inference that the periods are not confined to any part of our island, but will be found variously modified in all. Referring to the papers above mentioned for a variety of facts relating to atmospheric periodicity, stated in a more elaborate way, I shall here briefly analyse the results of the Arbroath register and apply them to my object, saying little about the barometer, however, because the present observations on this instrument, however constantly made from day to day, have not the comprehensive character of those insisted on in my former papers, which were taken from the face of a registering clock. The tables annexed to this paper, then, comprise the results of a daily meteorological register, kept in my instance, and with instruments furnished by myself in the Friends' Public School in Arbroath. I have observations, not so continuous, made at my own residence there, by collaboration with which, in many parts, I have satisfied myself that I can depend on these, for the purpose to which they are here applied, of deducing the differences of seasons from previous and subsequent ones of like denomination, by comparison with each other. As on former occasions, I shall have recourse to diagrams, which present to the eye with ease what figures would convey but slowly to the mind. The dotted curve, or flexuous line in Figure 1, shows a variation from year to year of the mean temperature, or average heat of the year. The mean of the climate, or average fall, of all the observations of these 18 years being 48 degrees .152. The 9 years from 1824 to 1832 average 48 degrees .952. The 9 years from 1833 to 1841 give 47 degrees .352. The difference of 1 degree 0.6 is about equal to the difference in warmth between Warkworth, north latitude 53 degrees, 38 minutes, 57 seconds, and London. I therefore call the former 9 the warm, and the latter 9 the cold years of the cycle. The curve shows palpably the bulk of the years of high temperature on the right and those of low temperature on the left of the dividing line, but with two striking exceptions. There is a very cold year, 1829, among the warm, and a very warm year, 1834, among the cold, and these considerably reduce the difference between the two averages. The comparison or contrast holds best, therefore, among the years in detail. The full flexuous line in Figure 1 shows the variation from year to year of the total rain collected by the gauge in each. It is not here as with the temperatures. The amount of rain is balanced, or nearly so, in each 9 years. Thus, out of 472.93 inches fallen in the whole cycle, 238.60 inches appear to have fallen on the warm, and 234.33 inches on the cold side, making the annual averages respectively 26.51 and 26.04 inches nearly, which is about an inch more on the whole per annum than is found to fall near London, the level being at the ground in both. If we now look through the curve, I beg pardon of mathematicians for applying the term to such a line, we shall probably be first struck with an extreme of dryness, 1826, followed by an extreme of wetness, 1828, on the warm side, then with a gradation from very wet, again following very dry in 1830 to very dry in 1835, and this again mounting by steps to extreme wet again in 1839. In fact, 10 years, from 1830 to 1839, show a gradual decrease and again an increase of rain, protracted through the half cycle, while 8 years from 1840 to 1829, passing thus back to make the cycle, show repeated and more extended oscillations, performed in shorter times, yet with results so nearly the same that the first set of years, here specified, show an average rain of 26.36 inches, while the second set averaged 26.16 inches. Again, on comparing rain with temperature, we find 1826 in the extreme at once of warmth and dryness, and 1839 in those of wet and coldness. But 1828, in the extreme of wetness, is equal in heat to the dry 1826, and 1829 is both dry and very cold. The quantity of rain, therefore, is not regulated by the temperature of the year. We may get it with heat, brought by winds highly vaporized from the tropic, or with cold from the condensation effected by the approach of northern air to our own atmosphere, previously charged with vapor to the full, and the dryness of 1829, with so much of cold, may have been the result of the great disposition of rain in the previous season. The only rule, then, that prevails throughout seems to be compensation. A wet year against dry one, etc., and so of whole runs of seasons, and we must examine the winds for the cause. This I have done in my paper before the Royal Society alluded to above, but the subject, complicated as it is with the moon's intricate orbit, and a varying influence on the currents that sweep these islands, is much too extended for the compass of this paper. We have to do here not so much with causes as with the effects they produce, a knowledge of which must necessarily go before the other. I shall proceed, therefore, at once from the review of the mean and temperature of whole years to an analysis of the distribution of these through the several months of the year, which will let us probably into the secret of the difference under equal qualities of rain, of the warm from the cold side of the cycle, as regards the most important of its effects, the fruitful or unfruitful character of our seasons. The full flexuous line in Figure 2 presents the monthly rain in its total amounts under each month for the 9 years 1824 to 1832, or warm period. The dotted curve, the same for the 9 years 1833 to 1841, or cold period of the cycle. I shall compare these with the temperature in another figure. The present object is to show the remarkably different distribution of the like quantity of rain in each. The warm period, then, shows December barely dry, its rain being 0.3 of an inch below the mean betwixt the driest and wettest months, which is at 19.59 inches. January, February and March are in the extreme of dryness. In April of this period, the rain suddenly mounts up to 0.43 inches above the mean, and descends again 3.5 inches below it to make us a fine May. The months of June and July, though high in the scale of rain, have the advantage, the former considerably, in dryness of those of like denomination in the cold period. But in August and September we see the case reversed, the amounts of rain in the warm exceeding by about 5 inches in each those of the cold period. October is wet in both nearly to the same degree, and by the by I may here observe that the rains in this month fall mostly by night, verifying a remark I heard many years since from a friend, that there are always 20 fine days in October. November, though wet, is drier on the warm side by a quantity exceeding 2.5 inches on the cycle. Of December, we have treated as regards this side, to turn now to the other. In the cold period, December is very dry, which dryness is ominous of wet in January, February and March, carrying a rain in these to an excess over the former period of 4.5, 7.75, and 3 inches respectively. To these succeeds a dry April, perhaps the worst feature of agriculture on the whole, the rain falling short of 9 inches of the former total. This want is hardly supplied by the more copious rains in June, for they come usually accompanied by far too much of wind in the summer of the cold period. August and September, contrary to what the inexperienced would predict, are much the drier months in the cold years, yet the lower temperature and cloudy sky counteract the early ripening of the crops. November mounts up in this period to the second place for wetness. It is the first in the neighbourhood of London, and often completes the destruction of what the drier weather of the preceding months had come too late to enable us to save. I shall not here, where I am more capable of the office, to point out to the experienced farmer the advantages and disadvantages to him of these different arrangements. They are the work of the all-wise Creator, ordered no doubt for the best on the great scale of things. It is for us, instead of vainly wishing them otherwise, to turn to the best amount, which we surely may, with their help, derived from accurate observation and a full record, the opportunities they present. The results in figures, from which the curves I have hitherto treated were laid down, will be found in tables in the following pages. Figure 3 gives the rain of each month, for the whole 18 years, represented by a full line, in connection with the average temperature of each month for the like series of years, in a curve, which may be so called without a qualifying remark, corresponding as nearly as those in my climate of London, with the curve of the sun's declination, which I have placed in a fine dotted line in connection with both. This diagram is instructive as regards the average increase of our rains as the sun approaches us from the south, and their falling off in quantity as he recedes towards the tropic of the other hemispheres, and it observes well for a test of the completeness of the account of temperature through the cycle, the solar and thermometric curve agreeing in form, with the like exceptions, as about London, of an accelerated rise in the spring and a retarded fall in the autumn, which I have shown in my work above mentioned to be the necessary conditions of our annual variation. The results and figures belonging to this beautiful curve will be found in the tables further on. In figures 4, 5, 6, and 7, I have given the rain and temperature of the 4 seasons of the year, through the cycle here treated, the numbers belonging to which will be found at the foot of each yearly table, 1824, winter, January to March, etc., at the end. To have treated these curves in detail would have involved a repetition, in substance, of much of what has been said upon the monthly averages. They will be found upon examination to present many curious gradations and coincidences in the increase and decrease of the rain and warmth of each season. They show also at a glance the difference in each between the warm and cold sides of the cycle, also what summers were partially warm and what winters cold, with the nature of the changes from year to year throughout in our most capricious season, the spring. As to rain, we see at once that the wet of 1824 and 1827 occurred chiefly in the autumn, as did also the drought of 1826 and 1829. That, in the very wet 1828, the rains fell chiefly in the summer, so that we had potatoes of 1.5 pounds in weight, and the crop unequalled in the whole cycle, after which the supply of this season fell gradually to 1832, was renewed in 1834 and balanced then by a dry autumn. In 1839 we see summer and autumn wet, in 1840 both seasons dry, but the most remarkable feature perhaps of the whole is the opposition of the curves of winter and spring from 1832 to 1841, the former plainly robbing the latter of its advances in the fore part of the period, and restoring the amount in the latter part. It is to show this peculiarity that I have placed the curves in the order they are found. In the winter, 1 lowest. The rains of the summers 1835 to 1838 appear to be given away partially to the autumn, partially to the winter. But it is needless further anticipated the reader in his remarks. The yearly mean heights of the barometer for the cycle taken at Arbroath School are as follows. The table is displayed on the page. Mean of warm period 29.851 inches. Mean of cold period 29.807 inches. The mean of the whole cycle is 29.829 inches. It appears then that the warm side has the higher average of pressure by 0.44 inches. This is consistent with my former observations as to the greater mean height belonging to the warmer portions of the year, which the reader will find in my Climate of London, Volume 2, page 281, First Edition, Volume 1, page 207, Second Edition. And the same reasons which there apply to single years will be found here to suit periods also. For the period from 1815 to 1823 averaged at Tottenham 29.788 inches, and that from 1824 to 1832 29.830 inches, giving thus an excess of pressure to the warm years over the preceding cold ones of 0.42 inches. My clock takes in the greatest depressions and makes the mean lower than it is obtained in the ordinary way, so that these averages of the school at Tottenham, though comparable respectively at each station, are not so with each other. And it is this, they agree with, remarkable nearness to the amount of excess of the warm period. The yearly mean temperatures for the cycle at Arbroath are as follows. The table is displayed on the page. Mean of warm period 48 degrees 0.952. Mean of cold period 47 degrees 0.352. Mean of the whole cycle 48 degrees 0.152. Excess of first 9 years 1 degree 0.60. If we leave out 1829 on one side and 1834 on the other, and average the remaining years, they come out thus. The first 8 years, 49 degrees 0.241. The latter, 47 degrees 0.011. Difference, 2 degrees 0.230. Now the 9 years from 1815 to 1823 average in the neighbourhood of London, 49 degrees 0.065, and the following 9 years, 1824 to 1832, 50 degrees 0.137. The difference in favour of the warm period being 1 degree 0.072. I might go on to prove another warm period, antecedent, and ending with 1814, averaging 49 degrees 0.383. But the locality, place style, differs, and the observations cannot so properly be brought into the comparison, though they show a small excess. Moreover, the method of computing by whole years and calendar months may bring out inaccurate results in an extended examination. I have proceeded in my paper now with the Royal Society on the solar year and the lunar divisions, which are more agreeable to nature. The cycle of 18 years depending on these principles. The reader will find the subject of periods of temperature largely treated in my published work above mentioned, which, as regards its details, is not in any degree superseded by the present paper. The reign of the cycle at Arbroath is as follows. A table is displayed on the page. Reign of the warm years, 238.60 inches. Of the cold years, 234.33 inches. Reign of the whole cycle, 472.93, or per annum, 26.27 inches. The warm side averaging 26.51 inches, the cold 26.037 inches. I have found cause on examining into past periods do conclude that the small excess of rain here found on the warm side is not a constant result, but that the cold may sometimes be the wetter. The main point affecting our harvests appear to be the different distribution of the rain within the year in each period, to which we now proceed. But first of the whole cycle. The following are the total amounts of rain for each month of the year through the cycle from 1824 to 1841, to which are next the monthly averages of heat or the mean temperature of each month for these 18 years. The reader will see, on comparing the latter with the curve of the sun's declination, see Figure 3, that the warmth, the coldness, thus averaged on a cycle, follow pretty strictly, though at some distance, as I have shown in The Climate of London, the proportionate height of the sun through the seasons, ascending thus to July and descending again to January, the rain itself being somewhat similarly affected, but with diminution of quantity in the spring months, and addition in the autumnal, depending on other causes. I treated these also in my work above mentioned, under the head of rain, to which I must here refer. The table is displayed on the page. All which the reader is requested to compare with the curves. Now for the distribution of the several months in the warm and in the cold period. The following are the results in figures. The table is displayed on the page. The reader will be pleased to compare the numbers with the curves in Figure 2. I have already made such remarks on these as may suffice for his help. On bringing into comparison the curve of the rain cycle 1824 to 1841 with that for the preceding cycle 1806 to 1823 in the neighbourhood of London, the following differences appear. At London, January, on the whole 18 years, has 10 inches more rain, March 5 inches more, April 7 inches less, May 6 inches more, June 18 inches less, and July about 10 inches. August and September have respectively 14 inches and 20 inches less at London. The two following months nearly agree in amount with Arbroath, as does February, but December was 20 inches drier at London. With these differences, the two curves still show the common feature of a general accordance with the sun's declination through the forward part of the year. But this is done away in the London curve, afterwards by the dryness of August and the extreme wetness of November and December. With the several cycles of amounts of rain, which we now possess, averaged for each year upon 9 successive years and thus reduced to easy curves, as I have done with the barometrical heights, these would undoubtedly present some striking features, leading to the true theory of our rains in Britain, but this is more than I can here undertake to produce. The following are observations made with one of my gauges, but my friend Thos Fowler, Esquire, of Tottenham, for 7 years past, placed in comparison with those of the school at Arbroath. A table is displayed on the page. The annual averages thus obtained are for Arbroath 26.50 and for Tottenham 25.67 inches. If we compare the amount throughout, we shall see the wet years coinciding, except in 1836, the drier years set against mean ones each way, and the total amounts affording each an average very near to that of the station itself. The two mean years, 1836 and 1837, at Arbroath, balance the wettest and the driest that occurred at Tottenham. The whole confirms a remark I have often made in passing to and fro, that we seldom see the Trent and the Thames full with rains. Together, their estuaries communicating with different portions of the surrounding sea, and the respective districts that feed their springs requiring somewhat different winds to furnish them with vapour. After acknowledging my obligations to the present and former superintendents and the successive clerks of the institution at Arbroath, it is proper I should caution my reader against expecting too much from the information here presented to him. Should he look for the same mean temperature and the same amount of rain in each returning year of the coming cycle, as are found recorded of a corresponding one in the past, he will probably meet with frequent disappointments, and this more especially in a locality somewhat different. We are yet far from being able to predict seasons in meteorology with a like certainty of date as the astronomer does in comparing phenomena of the heavens, and it is even possible that, from the very nature of the causes concerned, we may never arrive at this. The judicious observer, finding certain facts fully ascertained and clearly noted for him, will know how to make use of these for himself, and by watching their occurrence in detail, making notes as he proceeds, will endeavour to feel his own way towards the future. independently of empirical and fallacious predictions. This is the kind of service which I expect my present labour to render to the country, besides gratifying our reasonable curiosity as to the past. We do not expect to become skilful in other arts without a due share of study and practice, but we seem to forget this self-evident truth when we take up that of foretelling the weather. The facts here detailed cannot fail to be useful to such as will be at the trouble to examine and compare them, though the inferences they may draw from them should differ, and admitting only that in the course of years here treated, we experience in succession the various degrees of warmth and coldness, of rain and dryness incident to our climate, it must needs help the farmer, the market gardener, the planter or nurseryman, the grazier, the shipmaster, to have before him such an approximation to the times and order of their occurrence. A comparison in detail of the warmth and rain of successive seasons with the yield and quality of the harvest belonging to them would have formed perhaps a desirable appendage to the meteorology of my paper. But I have not before me the materials for this, and to have waited to collect them would have caused me much delay in publishing it, which I have reasons for wishing to avoid. The subject, moreover, viewed in this light, is a very copious one. It is not alone the grower of corn that is interested in a warm or a cold, a dry or a wet season. There are a variety of rural occupations and of trades and manufactures dependent on them, equally concerned in these, and we have the satisfaction of thinking that these are severally the best judges of their own needs and occasions, that each will be best able to avail himself to purpose of the meteorological facts established for him by the labours of men of science. There is a class of persons, however, to whom the paper may be immediately acceptable, and possibly also useful in regulating their future plans. The poor and valid may be soothed, and those of delicate constitutions encouraged by the immediate prospect of a 9 years' run of seasons having, with little exception, the higher temperature of our climate. It may be the means of inducing these to make trial, at least, of 1 or 2 of these, before they resort to other skies more favoured by natural position, by extending over countries far less desirable as residences to a truly British mind. And medical gentlemen, when they have read and considered what is here laid before them, may find arrangements in it to strengthen such a conclusion. At the present moment, when we are debating with earnestness the question of our corn importation, and while some are looking for an absolute scarcity, it cannot be uninteresting to public men to know what, in a scientific point of view, are the bearings of the question of climate and seasons on this other and more tangible one. That they are on the whole highly favourable will, I hope, be an announcement giving pleasure to both sides. Yet here also I must put in a word of caution. Plenty, I have shown, as regards our grain crops, is dependent partially on a sufficiency of warmth on the whole year, partially on rains administered in due seasons. But we may have a season or two to go through, in which, though our personal comfort may be increased by dry and hot weather, the crops may not be so well fed, or the sheep so well fatted, as we would have them. But we abound in resources, through the goodness of God to his creatures, and may cheerfully proceed to do our duty and make use of them, in reliance in the divine providence, happy also if, through his grace, we have learned to feel for the distress of others, and do for them in all respects that which we would they in like circumstances should do for ourselves. This is the great lesson which many of us have yet to learn, more perfectly to become more safely proud, in a good sense of the term, of the name of Christian. My countrymen will, I am sure, not be offended by this hint, from one now nearly of an age to be released from all public engagements, but who finding the matter before him and apprehending a public service in it, could not well forbear the present. Tottenham, Middlesex, March 31, 1842. End of A Cycle of 18 Years in the Seasons of Britain by Luke Howard. Recorded for LibriVox.org by Leon Harvey.
The Declaration of Arbroath, translated by Sir George Mackenzie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Alexandria Adair. A letter from the nobility, barons, and commons of Scotland in the year 1320, yet extant under all the seals of the nobility, directed to Pope John, wherein they declared their firm resolutions to adhere to their King Robert the Bruce as the restorer of the safety and liberties of the people, and as having the true right of succession, but, withal, they notwithstanding declare that, if the king should offer to subvert their civil liberties, they will disown him as an enemy, and choose another to be king for their own defense. Translated from the original in Latin, as it is insert by Sir George Mackenzie of Rosehew, in his observations on Precedenov, etc. To our most holy Father in Christ, and our Lord John, by the divine providence, chief bishop of the most holy Roman and universal Church, your humble and devoted sons, Duncan Earl of Fife, Thomas Randolph, Earl of Murray, Lord of Mania and Annandale, Patrick de Dunbar, Earl of March, Malicius, Earl of Strathern, Malcolm, Earl of Lennox, William, Earl of Ross, Magnus, Earl of Caithness and Orkney, William, Earl of Sutherland, Walter, Steward of Scotland, William de Soules, Belarius of Scotland, James, Lord of Douglas, Roger de Mowbray, David, Lord of Brecon, David de Graham, Ingelremus de Umfraville, John de Monteith, Warder of the County of Monteith, Alexander Fraser, Gilbert de Hay, Constable of Scotland, Robert de Keith, Marshal of Scotland, Henry de Sancto Claro, John de Graham, David de Lindsay, William Oliphant, Patrick de Graham, John de Fenton, William de Abernathy, David de Wemyss, William de Montesixo Fergus de Ardrossan, Eustachius de Maxwell, William de Ramsey, William de Monte Alto, Alan de Murray, Donald Campbell, John Camburn, Reginald Lechain, Alexander de Sutton, Andrew de Leslie, and Alexander de Stratton, and the rest of the barons and freeholders, and whole community or commons of the kingdom of Scotland. Send all manner of filial reverence with devout kisses of your blessed and happy feet. Most holy Father and Lord, we know and gather from ancient acts and records that in every famous nation this of Scotland hath been celebrate with many praises, this nation having come from Scythia the Greater, through the Tuscan Sea, and by Hercules' pillars, and having for many ages taken its residence in Spain in the midst of a most fierce people, could never be brought into subjection by any people, how barbarous soever, and having removed from these parts above 1200 years after the coming of the Israelites out of Egypt, did by many victories and much toil obtain these parts in the west, which they still possess, having expelled the Britons and entirely rooted out the Picts, notwithstanding of the frequent assaults and invasions they met with from the Norwegians, Danes, and English. And these parts and possessions they have always retained free from all manner of servitude and subjection, as ancient histories do witness. This kingdom hath been governed by an uninterrupted succession of 113 kings, all of our own native and royal stock, without the intervening of any stranger. The true nobility and merits of those princes and people are very remarkable from this one consideration, though there were no other evidence for it, that the King of Kings, the Lord Jesus Christ, after his passion and resurrection, honored them as it were the first, though living in the outmost ends of the earth, with a call to his most holy faith. Neither would our Saviour have them confirmed in the Christian faith by any other instrument than his own first apostle, though in order the second or third, St. Andrew, the most worthy brother of the blessed Peter, whom he would always have to be over us as our patron or protector. Upon the weighty consideration of these things, our most holy fathers, your predecessors, did with many great and singular favors and privileges fence and secure this kingdom and people, as being the peculiar charge and care of the brother of St. Peter, so that our nation hath hitherto lived in freedom and quietness, under their protection, till the magnificent King Edward, father to the present King of England, did under the colour of friendship and alliance or confederacy with innumerable oppressions infest us who minded no fraud or deceit, at a time when we were without a king or head, and when the people were unacquainted with wars and invasions. It is impossible for any whose own experience hath not informed him to describe, or fully to understand, the injuries, blood, and violence, the depredations and fire, the imprisonments of prelates, the burning, slaughter, and robbery committed upon holy persons and religious houses, and a vast multitude of other barbarities, which that king executed on this people, without sparing of any sex, or age, religion, or order of men whatsoever. But at length it pleased God, who only can heal after wounds, to restore us to liberty from these innumerable calamities by our most serene Prince, King, and Lord Robert, who, for the delivering of his people and his own rightful inheritance from the enemy's hand, did, like another Joshua or Maccabeus, most cheerfully undergo all manner of toil, fatigue, hardship, and hazard. The divine providence, the right of succession by the laws and customs of the kingdom, which we will defend till death, and the due and lawful consent and assent of all the people, made him our king and prince. To him we are obliged and resolved to adhere in all things, both upon the account of his right and his own merit, as being the person who hath restored the people's safety, in defence of their liberties. But after all, if this prince shall leave these principles he hath so nobly pursued, and consent that we or our kingdom should be subjected to the king or people of England, we will immediately endeavour to expel him, as our enemy and as a subverter, both of his own and our rights, and will make another king who will defend our liberties. For so long as there shall but 100 of us remain alive, we will never give consent to subject ourselves to the dominion of the English. For it is not glory, it is not riches, neither is it honor, but it is liberty alone that we fight and contend for, which no honest man will lose but with his life. For these reasons, most reverend Father and Lord, we do with most earnest prayers from our bended knees and hearts beg and entreat your holiness, that you may be pleased with a sincere and cordial piety to consider, that with him, whose vicar on earth you are, there is no respect nor distinction of Jew nor Greek, Scots nor English, and that with a tender and fatherly eye you may look upon the calamities and straits brought upon us, and the Church of God by the English, and that you may admonish and exhort the King of England, who may well rest satisfied with his own possessions, since that kingdom of old used to be sufficient for 7 or more kings, to suffer us to live at peace in that narrow spot of Scotland, beyond which we have no habitation, since we desire nothing but our own, and we, on our part, as far as we are able, with respect to our own condition, shall effectually agree to him in everything that may procure our quiet. It is your concernment, most holy Father, to interpose in this, when you see how far the violence and barbarity of the pagans is let loose to rage against Christendom for punishing of the sins of the Christians, and how much they daily encroach upon the Christian territories. And it is your interest to notice that there be no ground given for reflecting on your memory, if you should suffer any part of the Church to come under a scandal or eclipse, which we pray God may prevent during your times. Let it therefore please your holiness to exhort the Christian princes not to make the wars betwixt them and their neighbours as a pretext for not going to the relief of the Holy Land, since that is not the true cause of the impediment. The true ground of it is that they have a much nearer prospect of advantage, and far less opposition, in the subduing of their weaker neighbours. And God, who is ignorant of nothing, knows with how much cheerfulness both our king and we would go thither, if the King of England would leave us in peace, and we do hereby testify and declare it to the Vicar of Christ and to all Christendom. But if your holiness shall be too credulous of the English misrepresentations, and not give firm credit to what we have said, nor desist to favour the English to our destruction, we must believe that the Most High will lay to your charge all the blood, loss of souls, and other calamities that shall follow on either hand, betwixt us and them. Your holiness in granting our just desires will oblige us in every case, where our duty shall require it, to endeavour your satisfaction, as becomes the obedient sons of the Vicar of Christ. We commit the defence of our cause to him who is the sovereign king and judge. We cast the burden of our cares upon him and hope for such an issue as may give strength and courage to us and bring our enemies to nothing. The Most High God long preserve your serenity and holiness to his holy church. Given at the monastery of Arbroath in Scotland, the 6th day of April, in the year of grace 1320, and of our said king's reign the 15th year. End of the Declaration of Arbroath.
Memorial presented by the French ambassador, Citizen Perignon, to the Spanish minister at Madrid, Don Godoy, relative to the victory obtained by Earl St. Vincent over the fleet of Spain on the 14th of February, 1797, translated by Sir Robert Walpole for the express information of Earl St. Vincent. By Catherine Dominique de Perignon, 1st Marquis de Perignon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Directory, having heard, with astonishment and surprise, the unexpected issue of the naval engagement between His Catholic Majesty's squadron and the English, I am commanded, by an express just come to my hand, immediately to lay before His Majesty the true motives that have contributed to the malign loss which, with remarkable disgrace in its honour, the Spanish flag has experienced. I, most excellent sir, am well persuaded that your Excellency's justice and rectitude will not permit those false reports to reach the King's ears, by which a detestable policy would willingly disguise so shameful an action, by confounding virtue and guilt with a view to impunity. But, lest under this misfortune the King should incline to receive an impression from the false excuses which, in such circumstances, the culpable are industrious in framing, I shall not do justice to the confidence which I am honoured by my nation, if I do not refute, in His Majesty's presence, as many as attempt to confound truth with falsehood. Before that moment arrives, the Executive Directory ordered me to give your Excellency this information, that you may carry it up to the King. The arms of Spain have at all times supported the character of distinguished valour, talent, and military skill, which is peculiar to them. Only in the late days have they degenerated, causing all Europe to change its system respecting that superiority, which Spain was in possession of for ages. It is the infirmities of governments to be seized with certain cancers, which contaminate and corrupt the state. To save the body politic from perishing, caustics and the knife must extirpate the root of this pernicious weed. The Navy, most excellent sir, has given us an evident proof of this irrefragable truth. They, in place of humbling the English pride, which had begun to decline from the high opinion to which she was elevated by her natural haughtiness, has raised her insolence to a height unparalleled. From this, so powerful a cause, commerce, the basis of your monarchy, is going to suffer an irrefragable loss. The whole nation detests the vile proceedings of the Navy, and weeps with respectful apprehensions for the misfortune that must ensue. The squadron would not fight. Let us withdraw the veil from treason. They have bartered and compromised the national honour. So it has been made to appear to the Directory by authentic and sure documents. That Directory, ever watchful for the honour of her allies, cannot see with indifference such turpitude, tending to produce the most pernicious and fatal consequences. I, most excellent sir, in the name of the Directory, entreat your Excellency to dispose the mind of the King, with inflexible resolution, to chastise this enormity, stifling for a moment the dictates of paternal affection. The undersigned entertains this hope, and that your Excellency will be pleased to give an answer to this memorial, that it may be transmitted to the Directory. Signed, Perignon. End of Memorial presented by the French ambassador, Citizen Perignon, to the Spanish minister at Madrid, Don Godoy, relative to the victory obtained by Earl St. Vincent over the fleet of Spain on the 14th of February, 1797. Translated by Sir Robert Walpole for the express information of Earl St. Vincent. By Catherine Dominique de Perignon. Read by Alister. Answer of the Spanish minister to a memorial or remonstrance presented by Citizen Perignon, French ambassador at Madrid, upon the defeat of the Spanish fleet off Cape St. Vincent by the British fleet, by Manuel Godoy y Alvarez de Faria Rios. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Citizen Ambassador, I have with great reluctance laid before the King the heads and purport of the memorial presented by your Excellency in the name of the Directory of the French Republic. I say the heads of that memorial, because the language it contained is couched in terms so offensive, so debasing, so insolent to the ears of a free people, that I deemed it quite inconsistent with the dignity of my station to present it in the form it stood to an independent sovereign. The King, sir, laments with great sincerity the unexpected and severe loss which has befallen His Majesty's arms in the late engagement with the British fleet. and is naturally led in support of his own honour, as well as the honour of the Spanish nation, to make becoming inquiry into the cause of that misfortune. But he will not suffer for a moment the Directory of the French Republic, nor any foreign power whatever, to assume a privilege of interference in the smallest degree with the concerns of his kingdom. It is true, as stated in the memorial of your master, that the naval arms of Spain have hitherto been eminently distinguished among nations, and on that account any humiliation at sea is felt with the greater force and mortification by his Majesty. But it cannot but seem very extraordinary indeed to the King, and to his Majesty's subjects in general, that the loss of one action should be reviewed as a matter of surprise by the French nation. Surely, sir, the Directory of the French Republic are not unacquainted with the reproach of a naval defeat. They are pleased to observe that the Spanish flag has suffered a remarkable disgrace to its honour, and that they, as the allies of his Catholic Majesty, cannot with indifference behold such turpitude. Are these gentlemen the members of the same assembly who embarked on board your fleet on the 3 memorable days of the 30th and 31st of May and the 1st of June, 1794? Are these gentlemen the commissioners who assumed the rank and station of naval field-marshals upon that occasion, who before the commencement of the action with the British fleet sent a frigate with an insolent message to each ship of your line, viz., that the commissioners gave positive orders to the separate captains that they were to sink to the bottom every English man-of-war, only excepting the Royal Charlotte, which carried the British commander's flag? Out of their mercy that ship they were to spare, but they were to bring her safe into the harbour of Brest, in order to grace the triumph of the glorious New Republic. But who, instead of performing this act of heroism, were in the end very happy to make their escape from the cowardly English, with the loss of 9 capital ships. And are these the gentlemen who are prescribing to the King of Spain what punishment he is to inflict upon the commanders of the Spanish fleet for the loss of a battle, while the English have in their possession at this moment the 1/2 of their navy? We did not hear, sir, any punishment proposed for the Directory for the defeat of your impregnable fleet on the 1st of June. On the contrary, it was asserted in that solemn assembly that, for the arms of France even to meet the English in an action at sea, it was of itself sufficient and equal to a victory. I am stating here to your Excellency the history of 3 only of the naval exploits of your Republic, but almost every day since its commencement might have accustomed the eyes and ears of your Directory to the turpitude of naval defeats. Therefore, previous to your Excellency's approaching the presence of His Majesty, where you threaten to speak your opinion of the guilt of the officers who commanded his fleet, I would advise you, as a friend and ally, to balance the disgrace of the 2 nations, to take in one hand the single defeat of the arms of Spain off the Cape of St. Vincent, while in the other you carry the various defeats and disgraces that have befallen the navy of the French Republic ever since the commencement of its career, and see which weighs heaviest. Your Directory will then be convinced that, for either of our 2 nations to attempt to bring reproach on the other for their inferiority to the English in naval skill and courage, is nothing less than to arraign the wisdom of the Almighty Power, who has thought it good and proper to grant the decided superiority upon the wide and extended ocean to that brave people. The King, my master, has, in the meantime, commanded me to signify to the members of the French Republic that, whether it be true or not that it is the infirmity of government, as they state, to be seized with certain cancers which contaminate and corrupt the state, it is not His Majesty's intention to follow the example of degenerated France by applying caustics and the knife to remedy that evil, for which he has no occasion to suspend, even for a moment, the dictates of his paternal affection towards the subjects of his own states, which he is more than ever determined to cherish and cultivate, being firmly persuaded by his own observation, and which is confirmed to him by the historical experience of all nations, that no evil can be so great as to submit to the tyranny and oppression of a foreign government, nurtured and supported by the very dregs of the lower orders of society. Signed, Godoy. End of answer of the Spanish minister to a memorial or remonstrance presented by Citizen Perignon, French ambassador at Madrid, upon the defeat of the Spanish fleet off Cape St. Vincent by the British fleet. By Manuel Godoy y Alvarez de Faria Rios. Read by Alister.
The Geographical Knowledge of the North Pacific Ocean at the Beginning of the 18th Century by F.A. Golder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The numerous naval expeditions of the 16th century in search of a short passage to Asia gave the geographers a fairly good idea of the waters and shores of the Atlantic and of those parts of the Arctic that were nearest to Europe and European settlements. Equally helpful in making the Indian and South Pacific waters familiar to the educated world were the voyages via the Cape of Good Hope route to the Indies, China, and Japan, the annual voyages of the Spanish naval officers between Mexico and the Philippines, and the occasional raids of the English freebooters along the Spanish-American coast. From the early years of the 17th century onward, more or less reliable maps existed for the Pacific Ocean south of the parallel which runs through Cape Mendocino and the northern part of the main island of Japan, but for the vast region north of that line, not a single map that could in any way lay claim to accuracy was to be found before the time of the Bering voyages. It was not even known whether the North Pacific area was all land or all water, whether Asia and America were separated or united. There were many reasons for believing that islands or a continent were to be found in the northern regions. When the Jesuits came to Japan in the middle of the 16th century, they learned that north of Japan proper there was a body of land called Eizo, but they could not fully inform themselves as to its shape and size. A somewhat similar report reached Europe from another quarter. Richard Cox, an English merchant in Japan, in a letter written in 1611, made mention of an island called Yezo, which is thought to be rather some part of the continent Tartaria. But this was not the only vague information the cartographers had to go on. The credulous were as eager as ever to hear of islands with golden streets, and they accepted as a fact every baseless rumor which helped to confirm them in their belief. One of these rumors was that in the year 1582 or thereabouts, a Spanish vessel, in going from Manila eastward, ran into a storm which drove her to an island situated in latitude 37 degrees 30 minutes north and some 400 miles east of Japan. The inhabitants of this island were hospitable and rich to such an extent that even the pots and pans were made of gold and silver. Vizcaíno and Vries. The Spanish government attached enough importance to current gossip to send Sebastian Vizcaíno from Mexico in search of the rumored El Dorado. He spent the autumns of 1611 and 1612 in cruising north, south, and east of Japan, without, however, being able to locate the prize. In the meantime, the Dutch traders heard the story, and they in turn became interested. In 1639, the Dutch East India Company instructed Matthijs Quast and Abel Janszoon Tasman to find the Gold Island, but all their efforts were in vain. 4 years later, the company sent another expedition in command of Martin Gerritzoon Vries. He sailed north and east of Japan, setting the island of Etzo, without, however, being able to determine either its shape or its size, and among what are known now as the Coral Islands. One of these he named State Island, and the other, which he thought to be part of the American continent, Company Land. But neither gold nor silver did Vries find, though he sailed north to Sakhalin, south to Formosa, and east 460 miles from Japan. The Vries discoveries were put on the map by Janssen in 1650. The preceding year, 1649, another cartographer, Teixeira by name, published a map on which he marked the discoveries, in the early part of the 17th century, of a certain Juan de Gama, just about where Vries placed his Company Land, that is to say, between latitude 40 and 45 north. Company Land and Gama Land. It is no wonder that these three reports, that of the Jesuits, Vries, and Teixeira, of the three poorly described territories, Etzo, Company Land, and Gama Land, bewildered the cartographers. They were at a loss to know whether the lands in question were islands or continents, whether they were parts of America or of Asia, whether they were three distinct lands or one and the same. On the maps of the second half of the 17th and early part of the 18th century, all these views, and many others besides, found expression. Johann Baptist Homann of Nuremberg, on his map of about 1712, suggested that Terra Ausonis was probably the northwest coast of America, and the same land that Gama discovered. On the other hand, Guillaume de Lille, in a memoir which he read before the Paris Academy of Sciences in 1720, made the statement that Etzo was part of Asia, and that Japan was a peninsula of it. The difference in the point of view of these two men gives an idea of the confusion on the subject that existed at the beginning of the 18th century. There was only one way of clearing up these difficulties, and that was by actual investigation. The Russian advance in Siberia. During the century and a half that the cartographers were losing themselves in their speculations and paper explorations of the North Pacific, the Russian trappers, traders, tribute gatherers, and missionaries were wandering over the length and breadth of Siberia and pushing their discoveries to the Eastern Ocean. They had not, however, a clear idea of what they were doing. They had not even a very good mental picture of the land they discovered. By actual navigation, they learned that the Ob, Yenisei, and Lena emptied into the icy sea, that the Amur, Oud, and Akatna flowed into the eastern sea, but they were ignorant as to whether there existed a passage between these two seas. They knew that one could go by water from the mouth of the Ob to the mouth of the Lena, from the mouth of the Amur to the mouth of the Okata, but they did not know whether one could navigate from the mouth of the Lena to the mouth of the Akata. They were not agreed among themselves whether there was land to the north and east of the last two named rivers. Many of these Siberian hunters believed that not far from the mouth of the Kolyma River, a large continent, Bolshaya Zemlya, extended northward, and that the Asiatic mainland stretched out indefinitely to the eastward. Something was also said and known of the Adair and Kamchatka rivers, but they were supposed to discharge their waters into the Arctic. According to some curious Siberian maps of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Eastern Asia ended somewhere near the mouth of the Akata River, and Northern Asia close to the Yana River, and the two parts together, where they joined, formed a right angle. The areas which now go by the name of Kamchatka and the Chukchi Peninsula were then unnoticed. This may have been due to the Siberians' ignorance of the country or to their ignorance of the science of map-making. Peter the Great's interest. When Peter the Great came into power, he took deep interest in the activities of his energetic Cossacks and tried to give them intelligent guidance. He sent many of his Swedish prisoners of war into Siberian ports to teach his subjects to build sea-going vessels, to use nautical instruments, and to construct modern maps. Between 1700 and 1715, Kamchatka and the Kuril Islands were discovered and explored, and the terra incognita in Asia was pushed still farther eastward. Reports of these discoveries reached the scientific men of Western Europe, and when Peter came among them in 1716 and 1717, they discussed with him the question of the North Pacific, and urged him to settle once and for all the problem whether Asia and America were united. Peter accepted for himself and for his country the honor and the responsibility, and carried the undertaking through successfully, although at the time his success was somewhat doubted. When Bering's second expedition came to an end in 1749, Bering Strait had been discovered. The Arctic coast of Asia, from the White Sea to the Kolyma River, had been charted, and the North Pacific coast of America, from Cape Addington to Bering Island, had been placed on the map. This was Russia's share in the work of discovery and exploration, and a very important contribution to geographical knowledge it was. End of the geographical knowledge of the North Pacific Ocean at the beginning of the 18th century, by F.A. Golder. Read by Phil Schempf.
On the Mode of Communication of Cholera by John Snow, M.D. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Peter Yearsley. It is not the intention of the writer to go over the much debated question of the contagion of cholera. An examination of the history of that malady, from its first appearance, or at least recognition, in India in 1817, has convinced him, in common with a great portion of the medical profession, that it is propagated by human intercourse. Its progress along the great channels of that intercourse, and the very numerous instances, both in this country and abroad, in which cholera dates its commencement in a town or village previously free from it, to the arrival and illness of a person coming from a place in which the disease was prevalent, seem to leave no room for doubting its communicability. It is quite true that a great deal of argument has been employed on the opposite side, and that many eminent men hold an opposite opinion. But besides the objection that negative evidence ought not to overthrow that of a positive kind, the instances that are believed to oppose the proofs of communication are reasoned upon in the opinion that cholera, if conveyed by human intercourse, must be contagious in the same way that the eruptive fevers are considered to be, namely by emanations from the sick person into the surrounding air, which enter the system of others by being inhaled and absorbed by the blood passing through the lungs. There is, however, no reason to conclude a priori that this must be the mode of communication of cholera, and it must be confessed that it is difficult to imagine that there can be such a difference in the predisposition to be affected or not by an inhaled poison as would enable a great number to breathe it without injury in a pretty concentrated form, the immunity not having been earned by a previous attack, as in the case of measles and so on, whilst others should be killed by it when millions of times diluted. The difficulties that beset this view are of the same kind, but not so great, as those which surround the hypothesis of a cholera poison generally diffused in the air, and not emanating from the sick. Reasoning by analogy from what is known of other diseases, we ought not to conclude that cholera is propagated by an effluvium. In all known diseases in which the blood is poisoned in the first instance, general symptoms, such as rigours, headache, and quickened pulse, precede the local symptoms, but it has always appeared, from what the writer could observe, that in cholera the alimentary canal is first affected, and that all the symptoms not referable to that part are consecutive, and apparently the result of the local affection. In those cases in which vertigo, lassitude, and depression precede the evacuations from the bowels, there is no reason to doubt that exudation of the watery part of the blood, which is soon copiously discharged, is already taking place from the mucous membrane, whilst in the cases in which the purging comes on more gradually, there is often so little feeling of illness that the patient cannot persuade himself that he has the cholera, or apply for remedies until the disease is far advanced, this being a circumstance which increases the mortality. The quantity of fluid lost by purging and vomiting, taking into consideration the previous state of the patient, the suddenness of the attack, and the circumstance that the loss is not replaced by absorption, has seemed sufficient, in all the cases witnessed by the writer, to account, by the change it must occasion in the quantity and composition of the blood, for the collapse, difficulty of breathing, and, in short, for all the symptoms, without assuming that the blood is poisoned, until it become so by the retention of matters which ought to pass off through the kidneys, the functions of which are, however, suspended by the thickened state of the blood, which will scarcely allow it to pass through the capillaries. Footnote: the valuable analyses of Dr. Garrod have recently fully confirmed what had been stated in the former visitation of Europe by the cholera, namely, that the solid contents of the blood of patients labouring under this disease are greatly increased in proportion to the water, a state of the blood that is not met with in any other malady. End footnote. It is generally assumed that the blood becomes so altered by the cholera poison that its watery and saline parts begin to exude by the mucous membrane of the alimentary canal, but it is more consonant with experience, both therapeutical and pathological, to attribute the exudation to some local irritant of the mucous membrane, no instance suggesting itself to the writer in which a poison in the blood causes irritation of and exudation from a single surface, as in cholera. For the sweating, as the patient approaches to collapse, is only what takes place in other cases from loss of blood, during fainting and in any state in which the force of the circulation is greatly reduced. Having rejected effluvia and the poisoning of the blood in the first instance, and being led to the conclusion that the disease is communicated by something that acts directly on the alimentary canal, the excretions of the sick at once suggest themselves as containing some material which, being accidentally swallowed, might attach itself to the mucous membrane of the small intestines, and there multiply itself by the appropriation of surrounding matter, in virtue of molecular changes going on within it, or capable of going on as soon as it is placed in congenial circumstances. Such a mode of communication of disease is not without precedent. The ova of the intestinal worms are undoubtedly introduced in this way. The affections they induce are amongst the most chronic, whilst cholera is one of the most acute. But duration does not, of itself, destroy all analogy amongst organic processes. The writer, however, does not wish to be misunderstood as making this comparison so closely as to imply that cholera depends on veritable animals, or even animalcules, but rather to appeal to that general tendency to the continuity of molecular changes, by which combustion, putrefaction, fermentation, and the various processes in organized beings are kept up. Whilst it is matter almost of certainty that intestinal worms are in this way communicated, it is never possible to trace the communication from one person to another. Hence, if this be the mode of the propagation of cholera, there must often be great difficulty in detecting it. That a portion of the ejections or dejections must often be swallowed by healthy persons is, however, a matter of necessity. The latter even are voided with such suddenness and force that the clothes and bedding scarcely fail to become soiled, and being almost devoid of colour and odour, the presence of the evacuations is not always recognized. Hence they become attached, unobserved, to the hands of the person nursing the patient, and are unconsciously swallowed, unless care be taken to wash the hands before partaking of food. Or, if the person waiting on the sick have to prepare food for the rest of the family, as often happens, the material of communication here suggested has a wider field in which to operate, and where the patient, or those waiting on him, are occupied in the preparation or vending of provisions, the disease may be conveyed to a distance and into quarters having apparently no communication with the sick. All the observers who have recorded their opinions on the subject agree in attributing a great influence to want of personal cleanliness in increasing the prevalence and fatality of cholera. Dr. Lichtenstadt, in a work on cholera published in 1831, states, quote, that at Beredichce in Volhynia, a place of a few thousand inhabitants, no less than 900 were attacked in 31 days. Amongst 764 of these were 658 Jews and only 106 Christians, although the Jewish population is far from being proportionally so great, and among the Christians attacked the deaths were 61.3%, while among the Jews they were 90.7%. The only reason assigned by the reporter for these extraordinary differences is the excessive disregard of cleanliness among the Jewish inhabitants. End quote. The first appearance of cholera in many of the towns of this country, in 1832, was in the courts and alleys to which vagrants resort for a night's lodging, where it often lingered for some time before spreading to the more cleanly part of the people. The views here explained open up to consideration a most important way in which the cholera may be widely disseminated, namely by the emptying of sewers into the drinking water of the community, and as far as the writer's inquiries have extended, he has found that in most towns in which the malady has prevailed to an unusual extent, this means of its communication has existed. The joint town of Dumfries and Maxwell Town, not usually an unhealthy place, has been visited by the cholera both in 1832 and at the close of last year with extreme severity. On the last occasion, the deaths were 317 in Dumfries and 114 in Maxwell Town, being 431 in a population of 14,000. The inhabitants drink the water of the Nith, a river in which the sewers emptied themselves, their contents floating afterwards to and fro with the tide. Glasgow, which has been visited so severely with the malady, is supplied, as I understand, with water from the Clyde, by means of an establishment situated a little way from the town and higher up the stream, and the water is professed to be filtered. But as the Clyde is a tidal river in that part of its course, the contents of the sewers must be washed up the stream, and whatever care may be taken to get the supply of water when the tide is down, it cannot be altogether free from contamination. In the epidemic of 17 years ago, the cholera was much more prevalent in the south and east districts of London, which are supplied with water from the Thames and the Lee, where these rivers are much contaminated by the sewers, than in the other parts of the metropolis, differently supplied, and this is precisely what has occurred again, as will be shown further on. The opinions now made known have been entertained by the author since the latter part of last year, and were mentioned by him to several medical gentlemen in the winter, amongst others to Dr. Garrod and Dr. Parkes. But he hesitated to publish them, thinking the evidence in their favour of so scattered and general a nature as not to be likely to make a ready and easy impression. Within the last few days, however, some occurrences have come within his knowledge which seem to offer more direct proof, and have induced him to take the present course. In Thomas Street, Horsley Down, there are two courts close together, consisting of a number of small houses or cottages inhabited by poor people. The houses occupy one side of each court or alley, the south side of Truscott's Court and the north side of the other, which is called Surrey Buildings, being placed back to back, with an intervening space divided into small back areas, in which are situated the privies of both the courts, communicating with the same drain. and there is an open sewer which passes the further end of both courts. Now, in Surrey buildings the cholera has committed fearful devastation, whilst in the adjoining court there has been but one fatal case, and another case that ended in recovery. In the former court, the slops of dirty water poured down by the inhabitants into a channel in front of the houses got into the well from which they obtained their water, this being the only difference that Mr. Grant, the Assistant Surveyor for the Commissioners of Sewers, could find between the circumstances of the two courts, as he stated in his report to the Commissioners. The well in question was supplied from the pipes of the South London Waterworks, and was covered in on a level with the adjoining ground, and the inhabitants obtained the water by a pump placed over the well. The channel mentioned above commenced close by the pump. Owing to something being out of order, the water for some time past occasionally burst out at the top of the well and overflowed into the gutter or channel, afterwards flowing back again, mixed with the impurities, and crevices were left in the ground or pavement, allowing part of the contents of the gutter to flow at all times into the well. And when it was afterwards emptied, a large quantity of black and highly offensive deposit was found in it. The first case of cholera in this court occurred on July the 20th, in a little girl who had been labouring under diarrhoea for 4 days. This case ended favourably. On the 21st of July, the next day, an elderly female was attacked with the disease, and was in a state of collapse at 10 o'clock the same night. This patient partially recovered, but died of some consecutive affection on August the 1st. Mr. Vinan of Tooley Street, who attended these cases, states that the evacuations were passed into the beds, and that the water in which the foul linen would be washed would inevitably be emptied into the channel mentioned above. Mr. Russell of Thornton Street, Horsley Down, who attended many of the subsequent cases in the court, and who, along with another medical gentleman, was the first to call the attention of the authorities to the state of the well, says that such water was invariably emptied there, and the people admit the circumstance. About a week after the above two cases commenced, a number of patients were taken ill nearly together, 4 on Saturday, July the 28th, 7 or 8 on the 29th, and several on the day following. The deaths in the cases that were fatal took place as follows: 1 on the 29th, 4 on the 30th, and 1 on the 31st of July, 2 on August the 1st, and 1 on August the 2nd, 5th, and 10th, respectively, making 11 in all. They occurred in 7 out of the 14 small houses situated in the court. The 2 first cases on the 20th and 21st may be considered to represent about the average amount of cases for the neighbourhood, there having been just that number in the adjoining court about the same time. But in a few days, when the dejections of these patients must have become mixed with the water the people drank, a number of additional cases commenced nearly together. The patients were all women and children, the men living in the court not having been attacked. But there has been no opportunity hitherto of examining into the cause of exemption, as the surviving inhabitants had nearly all left the place when the writer's attention was called to this circumstance. In Albion Terrace, Wandsworth Road, there has been an extraordinary mortality from cholera, which was the more striking as there were no other cases at the time in the immediate neighbourhood. The houses opposite to, behind, and in the same line at each end of those in which the disease prevailed, having been free from it. The row of houses in which the cholera prevailed to an extent probably altogether unprecedented in this country constituted the genteel suburban dwellings of a number of professional and tradespeople, and are most of them detached a few feet from each other. They are supplied with water on the same plan. In this instance, the water got contaminated by the contents of the house drains and cesspools. The cholera extended to nearly all the houses in which the water was thus tainted, and to no others. These houses are numbered from 1 to 17 in Albion Terrace, and are supplied with water from a copious spring in the road in front of the terrace, the water of which is conducted by a brick barrel drain between numbers 7 and 8 to the back of the houses, and then flows right and left to supply tanks in the ground behind each house, the tanks being made of brickwork and cement, covered with a flat stone, and connected with each other by stoneware pipes 6 inches in diameter. A leaden pipe conveyed water from each tank to a pump situated in the back kitchen. There is a cesspool behind each house, under the privy, and situated 4 feet from the water tank. The ground was opened, and the drains examined, under the superintendence of Mr. Grant, the Assistant Surveyor, behind the houses number 1 and number 7. The cesspools at both these places were quite full, and the overflow drain from that at number 1 choked up. At this house, the respective level of the cesspool and the water tank were measured, and the top of the overflow drain from the cesspool was found to be 15 inches above the top of the tank, and the intervening ground was very wet. The overflow drain mentioned above had no bottom, or one so soft that it could be penetrated with a stick, and it crossed at right angles above the earthenware pipe of the water tank, the joints of which were leaky and allowed the water to escape. Behind number 7, Mr. Grant found a pipe for bringing surplus water from the tanks, communicating with a drain from the cesspool, and he found a flat brick drain laid over the barrel drain before mentioned, which brings the water from the spring. It appears, from a plan of the property, that this drain, which is continued in a direction towards the sewer in Battersea Fields, brings surface drainage from the road, and receives the drains from the cesspools, the house drains from the sinks in the back kitchens, and the surplus water, or some of it, from the tanks. There is every reason to believe that this drain is stopped up, but that has not yet been ascertained. At all events, it was unable to convey the water flowing into it during the storm on July the 26th, as it burst near the house number 8, and inundated the lower premises of that and the adjoining house number 9 with fetid water, and it was from this time that the water, which had occasionally been complained of before, was found by most of the people in these 17 houses to be more or less impure or disagreeable. The water broke out of the drain again at number 8, and overflowed the kitchens during a heavy rain on August the 2nd. It should be particularly remarked that the tanks are placed on the same level, so that pumping from one will draw water from the others, and that any impurity getting into one tank would consequently be imparted to the rest. The first case of cholera occurred at number 13 on July the 28th, 2 days after the bursting of the drain, in a lady who had had premonitory symptoms for 3 or 4 days. It was fatal in 14 hours. There was an accumulation of rubbish in the cellar of this house, which was said to be offensive by the person who removed it, but the proprietor of the house denied this. A lady at number 8 was attacked with choleric diarrhea on July the 30th. She recovered. On August the 1st, a lady aged 81 at number 6, who had had some diarrhea 8 or 10 days before, which had yielded to her own treatment, was attacked with cholera. She died on the 4th with congested brain. Diarrhea commenced on August the 1st in a lady aged 60 at number 3. Collapse took place on the 5th and death on the 6th. On August the 3rd there were 3 or 4 cases in different parts of the row of houses, and 2 of them terminated fatally on the same day. The attacks were numerous during the following 3 or 4 days, and after that time they diminished in number. More than half the inhabitants of the part of the terrace in which the cholera prevailed were attacked with it, and upwards of half the cases were fatal. The deaths occurred as follows, but as some of the patients lingered a few days and died in the consecutive fever, the deaths are less closely grouped than the seizures. There was 1 death on July the 28th, 2 on August the 3rd, 4 on the 4th, 2 on the 6th, 2 on the 7th, 4 on the 8th, 3 on the 9th, 1 on the 11th, and 1 on the 13th. These make 20 fatal cases, and there were 4 or 5 deaths besides amongst those who were attacked after flying from the place. The fatal cases were distributed over 10 out of the 17 houses, and Mr. Mimpress of Wandsworth Road, who attended many of the cases, and to whose kindness the writer is indebted for several of these particulars, states that cases occurred in the other 7 houses, with the exception of 1 or 2 that were empty or nearly so. There were 5 deaths in the house number 6, and 1 of a gentleman the day after he left it and went to Hampstead Heath. The entire household, consisting of 7 individuals, had the cholera, and 6 of them died. There are no data for showing how the disease was probably communicated to the first patient at number 13 on July the 28th, but it was 2 or 3 days afterwards, when the evacuations from this patient must have entered the drains, having a communication with the water supplied to all the houses, that other persons were attacked, and in 2 days more the disease prevailed to an alarming extent. The water was found to be polluted by the contents of the drains and cesspools to a great extent. That removed by Mr. Grant from the tank behind number 1 had, when first taken out, an odour distinctly stercoraceous. It is less offensive now at the end of 12 days than when it was removed. It does not become clear on standing, owing to a kind of fermentation going on in it, which prevents the mud from entirely settling to the bottom of the vessel. After being filtered through paper, it is now quite clear, but retains a slightly disagreeable taste, and froths on being agitated. On evaporating 1,000 grains to dryness, there is a residue of nearly 2 grains over and above the residue of salts obtained by evaporating water obtained from a pump which is supplied from the same spring. This excess consists, there is no doubt, of soluble organic matters, the exact nature of which has not been determined. In the water tank behind number 7, there was a dark-coloured offensive deposit, 6 to 9 inches deep, although the depth of the tank was only 2 feet. There was also a scum on the surface of the water. Some of the deposit, which was removed, has been undergoing putrefactive fermentation, and giving off sulphuretted hydrogen ever since, having a tendency to expel the cork from the bottle in which it is kept. It possesses the odour of privy soil very distinctly. Various substances have been found in it which escape digestion, as the stones and husks of currants and grapes, and portions of the thin epidermis of other fruit and vegetables. Little pieces of paper were likewise found. Some of the water removed from this tank continued to ferment till a day or 2 ago, but is now quite clear and transparent, and although there are some portions of the fibrous structures of vegetables lying at the bottom of the bottle in which it is contained, the water itself has neither taste nor smell, and cannot, by either physical or chemical examination, be distinguished from that of the spring whence it originally proceeded. This circumstance shows in a remarkable manner the power of spontaneous putrefaction to free water from all impurities of an animal or vegetable nature. Many of the patients attributed their illness to the water. This is here mentioned as showing that they had drank of it, and at the same time found that it was impure. As explaining how persons might drink of such water before finding out its impurity, it may be stated that the grosser part of the material from drains and cesspools has a tendency, when mixed with water, to settle rapidly to the bottom. The only houses supplied with the same water after passing the tanks in Albion Terrace were 4 in Albion Street, but 3 of these have been empty for months, and the 4th is inhabited by a gentleman who always suspected the water and would not drink it. There were 2 or 3 persons attacked with cholera amongst those who came to nurse the patients after the water was condemned, and who consequently did not drink it. But these persons were liable, in waiting on the patient, to get a small portion of the evacuations into the stomach in the way first pointed out, and there might be food in the houses previously prepared with the tainted water. It is not here implied that all the cases in Albion Terrace were communicated by the water, but that far the greater portion of them were. That, in short, it was the circumstance of the cholera evacuations getting into the water which caused the disease to spread so much beyond its ordinary extent. The mortality in Albion Terrace is attributed by Dr. Milroy in a published report to the General Board of Health chiefly to 3 causes. Firstly, to an open sewer in Battersea Fields, which is 400 feet to the north of the terrace, and from which the inhabitants perceived a disagreeable odour when the wind was in certain directions. Secondly, to a disagreeable odour from the sinks in the back kitchens of the houses, which was worse after the storm of July the 26th. And lastly, to the accumulation in the house number 13, before alluded to. With respect to the open sewer, there are several streets and lines of houses as much exposed to any emanations there might be from it as those in which the cholera prevailed, and yet they were quite free from the malady, as were also 19 houses situated between the sewer and Albion Terrace. As regards the bad smells from the sinks in the kitchens, their existence is of such everyday and almost universal prevalence that they do not help to explain an eruption of cholera like that under consideration. Indeed, offensive odours were created in thousands of houses in London by the same storm of rain on July the 26th, and the 2 houses in which the offensive smell was greatest, namely numbers 8 and 9, those which were flooded with the contents of the drain, were less severely visited with cholera than the rest, the inhabitants having only had diarrhoea or mild attacks of cholera. The accumulation in the house number 13 could not affect the houses at a distance from it. It remains evident, then, that the only special and peculiar cause connected with the great calamity which befell the inhabitants of these houses was the state of the water, which was followed by the cholera in almost every house to which it extended, while all the surrounding houses were quite free from it. Although there are a great number of pumps supplied by wells in this metropolis, yet by far the greater part of the water used for drinking and for culinary purposes is furnished by the various water companies. On the south side of the Thames, the waterworks all obtain their supply from that river, at parts where it is much polluted by the sewers, none of them obtaining their water higher up the stream than Vauxhall Bridge, the position of the South London waterworks. Now, as soon as the cholera began to prevail in London, part of the water which had been contained in the evacuations of the patients would begin to enter the mains of the waterworks. Whether the materies morbi of cholera, which it has been shown there is good reason for believing is contained in the evacuations, would be sent round to the inhabitants, would depend on whether the water were kept in the reservoirs till this materies morbi settled down or was destroyed, or whether it could be separated by the filtration through gravel and sand, which the water is stated to undergo. Notwithstanding this filtration, the water in this part of town is not always quite clear, and sometimes it has an offensive smell when clear. The deaths from cholera in this district, which contains a very little more than a quarter of the population, have been more numerous than in all the other districts put together, as will be seen by the following table taken from the reports of the Registrar General. Out of the 7,466 deaths in the metropolis, 4,001 have occurred on the south side of the Thames, being nearly 8 to each 1,000 of the inhabitants. Note table, end note. Deaths from cholera in London registered from September the 23rd, 1848 to August the 25th, 1849. Districts of London. West. Population in 1841, 300,711. Deaths from cholera, 533. Deaths to each 1,000 inhabitants, 1.77. North District of London. Population in 1841, 375,971. Deaths from cholera, 415. Deaths to each 1,000 inhabitants, 1.10. Central District of London. Population in 1841, 373,605. Deaths from cholera, 920. Deaths to each 1,000 inhabitants, 2.48. East District of London. Population in 1841, 392,444. Deaths from cholera, 1,597. Deaths to each 1,000 inhabitants, 4.06. South District of London. Population in 1841, 502,548. Deaths from cholera, 4,001. Deaths to each 1,000 inhabitants, 7.95. Total for all districts of London. Population in 1841, 1,948,369. Deaths from cholera, 7,466. Deaths to each 1,000 inhabitants, 3.83. That division of London called the East District in the registration reports is supplied with water entirely by the East London Water Company. In the cholera of 1832 and 1833, the reservoirs of the company at Old Ford were entirely filled from the River Lee when the water flowed up with the rising tide from the Thames in the neighbourhood of Blackwall, and the River Lee itself receives some large sewers. The company have since obtained water from near Lee Bridge, above the reach of the tide, but whether they still supply themselves in part from the river at Old Ford, where their chief works and reservoirs are still situated, and if so, to what parts of their district the water so obtained is sent, cannot be here stated, for want of exact information. The cholera has prevailed to a considerable extent in the East Districts, as will be seen by the table, though not so much as on the south of the Thames. The North Districts have suffered very little from cholera as yet. St Pancras and Islington, which comprise a great portion of this division, are supplied with the New River water, which is brought from Hertfordshire. Hackney is supplied by the East London Waterworks, Hampstead by sources of its own, and Marylebone, which will again be alluded to, chiefly by the West Middlesex Waterworks. The whole of the central districts are likewise supplied from the New River, and this part of the town has suffered much less from cholera hitherto than the south and east divisions, although many portions of it are quite on a par with the worst parts on the south of the Thames as regards overcrowding and bad smells. The West District, together with Marylebone, are supplied with Thames water by the West Middlesex, Grand Junction and Chelsea waterworks. The West Middlesex Company obtain their water above Hammersmith, and the Grand Junction at Brentford. Both these places, and especially the latter, are, by the meandering course of the river, several miles above London, and unless, perhaps, at certain parts of the tide, are free from sewage water, except that of certain towns, as Richmond, Barnes, and so on, in which the cholera has not yet been prevalent. The Chelsea Company, which supplies Chelsea, Pimlico, Westminster, and part of Brompton, get their water at Chelsea, only 1 or 2 miles above Vauxhall, but they take great pains to filter it carefully. It will perhaps be remarked that the dilution of the cholera poison in the Thames would most likely render it innocuous, but as far as can be judged from analogy, the poison consists probably of organised particles, extremely small no doubt, but not capable of indefinite division, so long as they retain their properties. It will probably be objected to the views advanced in this paper that animal poisons, when swallowed, are generally destroyed in the stomach by the process of digestion, and indeed it is not improbable that the material which gives rise to cholera is often thus destroyed, and its effects resisted, since the complaint is very often observed to come on when the digestive powers have been weakened by a fit of drunkenness. It should be observed that the mode of contracting the malady here indicated does not altogether preclude the possibility of its being transmitted a short distance through the air, for the organic part of the faeces, when dry, might be wafted as a fine dust, in the same way as the spores of cryptogamic plants or the germs of animalcules, and entering the mouth might be swallowed. In this manner, open sewers, as their contents are continually becoming dry on the sides, might be a means of conveying the cholera independently of their mixing with water used for drinking. Mr. Russell of Horsley Down, who attended the first 2 cases of the disease occurring in London last autumn, that of John Harnold, a seaman just arrived from Hamburg, where the disease was prevailing, and that of a man named Blenkinsop, who came after the death of the former to lodge and sleep in the same room, and had the cholera 8 days after him, states that the next cases in Horsley Down, which commenced 3 or 4 days afterwards, were in a situation a little way removed from that of the 2 preceding, and having no apparent connection with it, except that an open sewer, up which the tide flows, runs past both places, and the sewage from the houses in the first neighbourhood is, when the tide rises, carried past those in the second. Footnote: some serious mistakes respecting these cases, note that of Harnold and Blenkinsop, endnote, have crept into the documents furnished to Dr. Parkes by the General Board of Health, as subject matter for his inquiry into the bearing of the earliest cases of cholera on the question of contagion, as will be evident from a comparison of the following quotations from Dr. Parkes's paper with the accompanying statement of the real circumstances. Quote, "The Elbe steamer left Hamburg on the 22nd of September and arrived in the river on the 25th. A seaman named John Harnold left the vessel and went to live at No. 8 New Lane, Gainsford Street, Horsley Down. On the 28th of September he was seized with symptoms of cholera and died in a few hours. It is stated in a letter to the General Board of Health from Mr. Russell, who attended the patient, that all the characteristic symptoms of cholera were present. Mr. Bowie, who inquired on behalf of the board into the particulars of the case, corroborated this statement. This may then be considered as an undoubted case of cholera. If the disease was imported thus from Hamburg, it did not spread in Horsley Down. 2 days subsequently, indeed, Mr. Russell was sent for to a patient in the same house, who fancied he had cholera, but on examining into particulars it turned out that the individual in question had been greatly alarmed at the death of the seaman, and was suffering more from the effects of fear than anything else. He was quite well in a few hours. No other person was taken ill in the house or immediate neighbourhood, although if the second case had not been inquired into, a vague story of communicated disease might have arisen in the neighbourhood." End quote. Now, the illness and death of John Harnold took place on the 22nd of September, and not on the 28th, and Mr. Russell attended the next case in the same room on September the 30th. There were, in this latter case, rice water evacuations, and amongst other decided symptoms of cholera, complete suppression of urine from Saturday to Tuesday morning, and the patient vomited incessantly for 24 hours after this, and afterwards had consecutive fever. Mr. Russell had seen a great deal of cholera in 1832, and had no doubt of this being a genuine case, and he has seen a great deal of the disease lately, and still continues of the same conviction. The mistake in the date alone at which the first case occurred alters the bearing of all the facts submitted to Dr. Parkes, even should the particulars of all the other cases be correct. The writer accidentally detected the errors pointed out in this note by having to call on Mr. Russell in his inquiries respecting Surrey buildings. End footnote. These opinions respecting the cause of cholera are brought forward not as matters of certainty, but as containing a greater amount of probability in their favour than any other, in the present state of our knowledge. Nearly all medical men admit a cholera poison, whatever their opinions may be with respect to contagion, and many of them even speak of the purging as an effort of nature to get rid of the poison. They cannot then in either case suppose that the evacuations are free from it, or that, being swallowed, the stomach should always have the power of destroying it and preventing it producing its peculiar effects. Therefore, the views here stated seem to have a fair claim to the consideration of the profession. At all events, the mode of communication of cholera is a question of the most vital importance with respect to its prevention. Who can doubt that the case of John Harnold, the seaman from Hamburg mentioned above, was the true cause of the malady in Blenkinsop, who came and lodged and slept in the only room in all London in which there had been a case of true Asiatic cholera for a number of years? And if cholera be communicated in some instances, is there not the strongest probability that it is so in the others? In short, that similar effects depend on similar causes. The belief in the communication of cholera is a much less dreary one than the reverse. For what is so dismal as the idea of some invisible agent pervading the atmosphere and spreading over the world? If the writer's opinions be correct, cholera might be checked and kept at bay by simple measures that would not interfere with social or commercial intercourse, and the enemy would be shorn of his chief terrors. It would only be necessary for all persons attending or waiting on the patient to wash their hands carefully and frequently, never omitting to do so before touching food, and for everybody to avoid drinking or using for culinary purposes water into which drains and sewers empty themselves, or if that cannot be accomplished, to have the water filtered and well boiled before it is used. The sanitary measure most required in the metropolis is a supply of water for the south and east districts of it, from some source quite removed from the sewers. It would have been more satisfactory to the author to have given the subject a much more extensive examination, and only to have published his opinions in case he could bring forward such a mass of evidence in their support as would have commanded ready and almost universal assent. But being preoccupied with another subject, he could only either leave the inquiry or bring it forward in its present state, and he has considered it to be his duty to adopt the latter course and allow his professional brethren to decide what there may be of value in his opinions, and he will be happy to receive any information bearing on the points discussed in his paper. Frith Street, Soho, August the 29th, 1849. The End. End of On the Mode of Communication of Cholera by John Snow, M.D.
Sleep and the Theories of its Cause. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in June 2026. Sleep and the Theories of its Cause, from Scientific American Supplement, number 1178, June 25, 1898. The theory of the origin of sleep, which has gained the widest credence, is the one that attributes it to anemia of the brain. It has been shown by Mosso and many others that in men with defects of the cranial wall, the volume of the brain decreases during sleep. At the same time, the volume of any limb increases as the peripheral parts of the body become turgid with blood. In dogs, the brain has been exposed, and the cortex of that organ has been observed to become anemic during sleep. It is a matter of ordinary observation that in infants, during sleep, the volume of the brain becomes less, since the fontanelle is found to sink in. It has been supposed, but without sufficient evidence to justify the supposition, that this anemia of the brain is the cause and not the sequence of sleep. The idea behind this supposition has been that, as the day draws to an end, the circulatory mechanism becomes fatigued, the vasomotor center exhausted, the tone of the blood vessels deficient, and the energy of the heart diminished, and the circulation to the cerebral arteries lessened. By means of a simple and accurate instrument, the Hill-Barnard's sphygmometer, with which the pressure in the arteries of men can be easily reckoned, it has been recently determined that the arterial pressure falls just as greatly during bodily rest as during sleep. The ordinary pressure of the blood in the arteries of young and healthy men averages 110 to 120 millimeters of mercury. In sleep, the pressure may sink to 95 to 100 millimeters, but if the pressure be taken of the same subject lying in bed and quietly engaged on mental work, it will be found to be no higher. By mental strain or muscular effort, the pressure is, however, immediately raised, and may then reach 130 to 140 millimeters of mercury. It can be seen from considering these facts that the fall of pressure is concomitant with rest rather than with sleep. As, moreover, it has been determined on strong evidence that the cerebral vessels are not supplied with vasomotor nerves, and that the cerebral circulation passively follows every change in the arterial pressure, it becomes evident that sleep cannot be occasioned by any active change in the cerebral vessels. This conclusion is borne out by the fact that to produce in the dog a condition of coma like to sleep, it is necessary to reduce, by a very great amount, the cerebral circulation. Thus, both carotids and both vertebral arteries can be frequently tied at one and the same time, without either producing coma or any very marked symptoms. The circulation is, in such a case, maintained through other channels, such as branches from the superior intercostal arteries, which enter the anterior spinal artery. While total anemia of the brain instantaneously abolishes consciousness, partial anemia is found to raise the excitability of the cortex cerebri. By estimation of the exchange of gases in the blood which enters and leaves the brain, it has been shown that the consumption of oxygen and the production of carbonic acid in that organ is not large. Further, it may be noted that the condition of anesthesia is not in all cases associated with cerebral anemia. Thus, while during chloroform anesthesia the arterial pressure markedly falls, such is not the case during anesthesia produced by ether or a mixture of nitrous oxide and oxygen. The arterial pressure of man is not lowered by the ordinary fatigue of daily life. It is only in extreme states of exhaustion that the pressure may be found decreased when the subject is in the standing position. The fall of pressure which does occur during rest or sleep is mainly occasioned by the diminished rate of the heart. The increase in the volume of the limbs is to be ascribed to the cessation of muscular movement and to the diminution in the amplitude of respiration. The duty of the heart is to deliver the blood to the capillaries. From the veins the blood is, for the most part, returned to the heart by the compressive action of the muscles, the constant change of posture, and by the respiration acting both as a force and suction pump. All of these factors are at their maximum during bodily activity and at their minimum during rest. On exciting a sleeper by calling his name, or in any way disturbing him, the limbs, it has been recorded, decrease in volume while the brain expands. This is so because the respiration changes in depth, the heart quickens, the muscles alter in tone, as the subject stirs in his sleep in reflex response to external stimuli. Considering all these facts, we must regard the fall of arterial pressure, the depression of the fontanelle, and the turgescence of the vessels of the limbs as phenomena concomitant with bodily rest and warmth, and we have no more right to assign the causation of sleep to cerebral anemia than to any other alteration in the functions of the body, such as occur during sleep. We may well here summarize these other changes in function. 1. The respiratory movement becomes shallow and thoracic in type. 2. The volume of the air inspired per minute is lessened by 1/2 to 2/3. 3. The output of carbonic acid is diminished by the same amount. 4. The bodily temperature falls. 5. The acidity of the cortex of the brain disappears. 6. Reflex action persists. The knee jerk is diminished, pointing to relaxation in tone of the muscles. Consciousness is suspended. Analyzing more closely the conditions of the central nervous system, it becomes evident that, in sleep, consciousness alone is in abeyance. The nerves and the special senses continue to transmit impulses and to produce reflex movements. If a blanket, sufficiently heavy to impede respiration, be placed upon the face of a sleeping person, we know that it will be immediately pushed away. More than this, complicated movements can be carried out. The postilion can sleep on horseback. The punkah wallah may work his punkah and at the same time enjoy a slumber. A weary mother may sleep and yet automatically rock her infant's cradle. Turning to the histories of sleepwalkers, we find it recorded that during sleep they perform such feats as climbing slanting roofs or walking across dangerous narrow ledges and bridges. The writer knew of the case of a lad who, when locked in his room at night to prevent his wandering in his sleep, climbed the partition 8 to 10 feet in height, which separated his sleeping compartment from the next, and this without waking. The brain can carry out not only such complicated acts as these, but it has been found to maintain during sleep its normal inhibitory control over the lower reflex centers in the spinal cord. Thus, in sleeping dogs, after the spinal cord has been divided in the dorsal region, reflexes can be more easily evoked from the lumbar than from the cervical cord, because the former is freed from the inhibitory control of the brain. The strength of stimulus necessary to pass the threshold of consciousness and to produce an awakening has been measured in various ways. It has been determined that it takes a louder and louder sound or a stronger and stronger electric shock to arouse a sleeper during the first 2 or 3 hours of slumber. After that period, the sleep becomes lighter and the required stimulus need be much less. The alternative theories which have been suggested to account for the onset of sleep may be classed as chemical and histological. In relation to the first, it has been suggested that if consciousness be regarded as dependent upon a certain rate of atomic vibration, it is possible that this rate depends on a store of intramolecular oxygen, which, owing to fatigue, may become exhausted. Or it may be supposed that alkaloidal substances may collect as fatigue products within the brain and choke the activity of that organ. Against this theory may be submitted the facts that monotony of stimulus will produce sleep in an unfatigued person, that overfatigue, either mental or bodily, will hinder the onset of sleep, that the cessation of external stimuli by itself produces sleep. As an example of this last may be quoted the case recorded by Strumpel of a patient who was completely anesthetic save for one eye and one ear, and who fell asleep when these were closed. Moreover, many men possess the power, by an effort of will, of withdrawing from objective or subjective stimuli, and of thus inducing sleep. The histological theories of sleep are founded on recent extraordinary advances in the knowledge of the minute anatomy of the central nervous system, a knowledge founded on the Golgi and methylene blue methods of staining. It is held possible that the dendrites or branching processes of nerve cells are contractile, and that they, by pulling themselves apart, break the association pathways which are formed by the interlacing or synapses of the dendrites in the brain. Ramon y Cajal, on the other hand, believes that the neuroglia cells are contractile and may expand so as to interpose their branches as insulating material between the synapses formed by the dendrites of the nerve cells. The difficulty of accepting these theories is that nobody can locate consciousness to any particular group of nerve cells. Moreover, the anatomical evidence of such changes taking place is at present of the flimsiest character. If these theories be true, what, it may be asked, is the agency that causes the dendrites to contract or the neuroglia cells to expand? Is there really a soul sitting aloof in the pineal gland, as Descartes held? When a man like Lord Brougham can at any moment shut himself away from the outer world and fall asleep, does his soul break the dendritic contacts between cell and cell? And when he awakes, does it make contacts and switch the impulses evoked by sense stimuli on to one or other tract of the axons, or axis cylinder processes which form the association pathways? Such a hypothesis is no explanation. It simply puts back the whole question a step further and leaves it wrapped in mystery. It cannot be fatigue that produces the hypothetical interruptions of the dendritic synapses and then induces sleep, for sleep can follow after fatigue of a very limited kind. A man may sleep equally well after a day spent in scientific research as after one spent in mountain climbing, or after another passed in idling by the seashore. He may spend a whole day engaged in mathematical calculation or in painting a landscape. He fatigues, if we omit the localization of function to definite parts of the brain, but one set of association tracts, but one group of cells, and yet when he falls asleep, consciousness is not partially, but totally suspended. We must admit that the withdrawal of stimuli, or the monotonous repetition, are factors which do undoubtedly stand out as primary causes of sleep. We may suppose, if we like, that consciousness depends upon a certain rate of vibration which takes place in the brain structure. This vibration is maintained by the stimuli of the present, which awaken memories of former stimuli and are themselves at the same time modified by these. By each impulse streaming into the brain from the sense organs, we can imagine the structure of the cerebral cortex to be more or less permanently altered. The impulses of the present, as they sweep through the association pathways, arouse memories of the past, but in what way this is brought about is outside the range of explanation. Perhaps an impulse vibrating at a certain rate may arouse cells or fibrils tuned by past stimuli to respond to this particular rate of vibration. Thus may be evoked a chain of memories, while by an impulse of a different rate quite another set of memories may be started. Tracts of association are probably formed in definite lines through the nervous system, as during the life of a child repeated waves of sense impulses beat against and overcome resistances, and make smooth pathways here and there through the brain structure. Thus may be produced growth of axons in certain directions, and synapses of this cell with that. If the same stimulus be often repeated, the synapses between groups of cells may become permanent. A memory, a definite line of action which is manifested by a certain muscular response, may thus become structurally fixed. If the stimulus be not repeated, the synapses may be but temporary, and the memory fade as the group of cells is occupied by a new memory of some more potent sense stimulus. Many association tracts and synapses are laid down in the central nervous system when the child is born. These are the fruits of inheritance, and by their means, we may suppose, instinctive reflex actions are carried out. So long as the present stimuli are controlled by past memories and are active in recalling them, so long does consciousness exist, and the higher will be the consciousness, the greater the number and the more intense the character of the memories aroused. We may suppose that when all external stimuli are withdrawn, or the brain soothed by monotony of gentle repetition, And when the body is placed at rest and the viscera are normal and give rise to no disturbing sensations, consciousness is then suspended and natural sleep ensues. Either local fatigue of the muscles or of the heart, or ennui, or exhaustion of some brain center usually leads us to seek those conditions in which sleep comes. The whole organism may sleep for the sake of the part. To avoid sleeplessness, we seek monotony of stimulus, either objective or subjective. In the latter case, we dwell on some monotonous memory picture, such as sheep passing one by one through a gap in the hedge. To obtain our object, we dismiss painful or exciting thoughts, keep the viscera in health, so that they may not force themselves upon our attention, and render the sense organs quiet by seeking darkness, silence, and warmth. L.H. in Nature. End of Sleep and the Theories of Its Cause, from Scientific American Supplement, number 1178, June 25, 1898.
A Study of Imaginations by George V. Dearborn, M.D. This LibriVox recording is the public domain. Recorded by Leon Harvey. A Study of Imaginations by George V. Dearborn, M.D., Harvard University. To see things in the ever-changing outlines of summer clouds, or among the flames and embers of a fire, has doubtless in all ages been to imaginative men a source of entertainment and delight. Much of the charm of this pastime comes no doubt from the commonly accompanying circumstance of leisure, and from the novelty of exercising an aspect of mind all too little used and given freedom. Another element in the interest of the habit, however, comes from the endless variation in the forms which different persons fancy from any given contour or any simple presented shape. For the purpose of studying the reproductive imaginations of men and women, the psychologist might well desire to take the clouds into his control and bid them serve him, but they are far beyond him and will not for a moment stay. To reproduce, then, under applicable and controllable conditions, these familiar studies of human fancy, the following simple means have been adopted, and they constitute the complete apparatus, simple enough, of the investigation. Chance blots of ink, made by presenting gently with the finger a drop of common writing fluid between two squares of paper, furnished all the variety of outline imaginable. More explicit suggestions for the manufacture and usefulness of these characters may be found in the Psychological Review for May 1897, page 390. To this article interested readers are referred. The bits of gummed paper, 3 centimeters square, bearing the blots, scarce any one of which resemble any other, were then attached to cards convenient for the hand and arranged in 12 sets of 10 blots each, the members of each set being numbered consecutively from 1 to 10 with Arabic, and the sets themselves in Roman numerals. Thus the back of every blot card bore a number by which it could be registered and identified. Figure 1 is a photograph in miniature of the whole series, the characters being numbered from above downward and the sets from left to right. Observation of the picture will show how great is the variety of design. The uncommonly great interest of the subjects in the research was largely due to this circumstance, and to secure the constant attentive effort of the subject is often no easy matter, although sometimes this means half the research done. The subjects were mostly students in the Harvard Psychological Laboratory, although professors and their wives and one Latin schoolgirl were among the rest. The range of ages was between 18 and 62, and the average nearly 35. The subjects were employed as was convenient, no selection of any sort being made, and hence they may be said, as far as any relation to imagination is concerned, to have been an average set from their particular social grade of culture and education. In the case of every subject, some brief sketch of his or her early life was obtained as regards familiarity with various animal forms, and concerning fairy stories, mythology, and the like, and as regards possible habit of watching clouds and other natural forms as a pleasure of the imagination. It was expected that subjects raised on a farm, hunters, and artists would have a sort of advantage of those of contrary habits. Among the subjects were 2 poets and 2 artists, and all of these were well toward the top in readiness and variety of response. One of these two poets made the shortest average of times, and the subject who had the longest average is a young man little fond of verse. The experiments were conducted with the subjects always in normal conditions, as far as could be learned, at an average hour of the day as regards fatigue and meals. Each was particularly instructed to look at the blot card always right side up, turning neither the card nor the head, to try to employ the whole character if possible, not allowing it to separate into parts while being observed, not to be too particular to get a perfectly fitted object in mind, but to tap at the moment of consciousness of the first suggested image, to react by sharp tap as properly as possible, to report each concrete object suggested as concisely as possible, with any suggested general action of the same, and especially only such details as occurred before reaction by the tap. The method of the experiments was then simply thus: a set of block cards being arranged in order face down, and a stopwatch in hand, after a warning, ready. 1 second previous, a blot was quickly placed before the subject at his or her proper visual distance. Upon the discovery of the blot's likeness to any object, the subject tapped, and at the same time being registered, a brief description of the suggested object was recorded opposite the number of the character, and so on through the entire series of 120, or more commonly, until decrease of interest or evident showing of reaction indicated the beginning of fatigue, which was carefully inquired after and noted. When the experiment was promptly suspended for the time, none of the subjects had seen the blots before the time of the experiment. As would be supposed, after observing the different characters as represented in the illustration, most of the replies to the general question, "What is it?" were various in the extreme. This variation is least in set number 1, as the blots of that file were selected and placed together as a first set, that their relative easiness might compensate for the novelty of the experience and slowness of reaction in unprofessional subjects. The figures in the accompanying table indicate in seconds averages of the times for the 10 blots composing each set. In these results, the interesting cases of apparent inhibition are included, it being practically impossible to discriminate such cases of exemption from slow examples of associative imagination, and no cases of inhibition being long or frequent enough to essentially vitiate the average of any subject. These periods of inhibition have an interest in themselves, for although, much like ordinary cases of amnesic aphasia, they differ from them in that here the blocking seems to be among the brain paths of currents representing objects instead of among those representing words, as is the common case. Perhaps for a minute or two the subject would sit staring at the blot, but wholly unable to see any resemblance in it to any object, and this wholly independent of any inherent oddity of the character and of inattention. The real nature of these inhibitions is a problem for further research to answer. If arising from confusion or indecision between two or more resembling objects, such confusion or indecision was in these cases wholly a subconscious process, appearing to the subject almost always merely as a cessation of a mental activity. A table is displayed on the page. Average times in seconds. The often considerable number of vacant seconds which elapse between the application of the stimulus and the reaction image offers a striking illustration of the entire subconsciousness of the processes of reproductive imagination, but including in these cases much more. Here was presented a blot of ink, perceived by the subject. The next thing in his consciousness was a name of some object resembling in some respect or many the stimulus, so that a complicated process necessarily intervened. Many ancient pigeonholes of the brain must have been searched, and the comparison made with the contents of each, followed by a judgment of greater agreement in some one case, a choice thereof, and the calling up and utterance of a name which again became consciousness, and this often in a fraction of a second. Such, we may conjecture, is the general process, although the many attempts at introspection gave wholly negative results. Frequent inquiry was made as to how, in what form, the suggested object came into consciousness, and the most frequent reply was that a name, articulate, visual or auditory, was the first of the object experienced. Sometimes then it was once or twice said, the connotations of the object developed. In some cases aphasia occurred, and a hazy likeness of the object coming hovered for a few seconds or less before the mind. Here is a problem for research. Instruments of precision for measuring small periods of time were not needed in these experiments, but intervals of not over half a second appear in several instances, such reactions being as fast as regular time reactions with judgmental choice and much more characteristic of the reacting subject than of the blots of which the reaction occurred. The longest time required, 3 minutes, very nearly, was by the subject with next to the longest general time average also. The two next longest were by two students of decidedly intellectual type. Neither age nor sex shows a distinct influence in these quantitative results. Habits of living, on the other hand, are clearly recorded in the figures as confirmed by knowledge of the various subjects' mental modes and occupations. The intellectual type appears in the numbers with like corroborative evidence. From the grand average of all the subjects' times, about 10 seconds, it is apparent that the reactions were slower than one might a priori estimate from a study of the blots. Facility developed noticeably in some cases. It is curious to observe that an equal number of subjects were above and below the quantitative average, also that the slowest and fastest were nearly an equal number of seconds from the mean time, which thus doubly appears to be a true average time of these 1,920 reactions. As a comparative mental test, this mode of experiment would seem to be valuable, representing accurately the mental functions upon which wit and mental liveliness depend. The qualitative portion of this research has more of interest than the quantitative, howbeit its results are not statable in exact terms nor expressible in figures. The qualitative side better, however, suggests the mysteries of association and of the imagination deep in the nervous substance, which future psychologists may explain. Each subject, it will be remembered, was instructed to report the first object which the blot suggested to him in each of the 120 cases. A comparison of these object images gives, therefore, curious and interesting results, and leads into mazes of scientific conjecture. In the case of no blot did over 40% of the subjects agree on any one suggested object. In several instances, no two of these subjects were reminded of the same thing. These two extreme blots are reproduced in Figure 2, the right blot numbered X10, having given the 40% of agreements, and the other 12-7, being one of those upon whose name no two agreed. A critical study of their outlines gives only one key of this great difference in difficulty, namely, that the one upon which there was agreement strongly suggests the familiar figure of a man with upturned coat collar. From out of the 120 blots, 3 have been chosen here as examples for a full report of the subject's answers, the times being also given for greater completeness. These 3 characters are reproduced in Figure 3, and their respective descriptions follow. Figure 2 and Figure 3 are displayed on the page. A table is displayed on the page. Why one subject should see in a blot a cabbage head, and the next an animal with its mouth open, or why a professor should be reminded by a blot of half a sweet pea blossom, and his wife of a snake coiled round a stick. Of course no one can at present pretend to explain. There is a temptation in such cases of association to these to call the results of the choice of chance, but this means too little or too much. It is clear that, as a general principle, the experience and especially the early experience of the subject has important influence. For example, study of the record shows that subject H, a purely domestic woman, is reminded most often of domestic objects, while subject O, who is an artist and student of mythology, sees in the blots many picturesque and fanciful things. The difference between the imaginations of the country and city bred is clear. Altogether, there is evidence here that the laws of the reproductive imagination, still for the most part hid in the neural paths, are substantial laws, which may one day be found entirely out and reduced to words and to more or less mathematical certainty of statement. Meanwhile, it is something to establish, if possible, in a manner unmistakably demonstrable, The empirical conditions under which this faculty of mind performs its marvellous combinations and effects. For the imagination is one of the most interesting as well as the most important phases of mentality. In particular, would it be interesting to know to what degree, if at all, the fixed ideas, delusions, and changed emotional conditions of what the Germans termed conveniently Dorowan influence and subvert the reproductive imaginations of the persons who are the victims of these obsessions and delusions, fixed into their mental natures deep as life. Perhaps an attempt to answer these interesting inquiries may form the substance of another research conducted with this same set of blocks. End of A Study of Imaginations by George V. Dearborn. Recorded for LibriVox.org by Leon Harvey.
Suicide of Animals by William Wynne Westcott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Public Domain Scholar. Suicide of Animals. The question, to what extent does the mind of one of the lower animals resemble that of man, has been argued by many able men, but no very definite decision has been arrived at. The point is of prime importance in the consideration of whether animals can commit suicide. I mean, can animals kill themselves intentionally, either as the result of consideration and choice or of impulse? No one doubts that animals may die from some voluntary action of their own. For example, a dog may die of eating poisoned food, or a horse may die from a blow caused by jumping over a space with insufficient caution and observation, or a monkey may cut his throat by imitating a man shaving. Similar deaths would not be called suicide in man. The tendency of the present day is rather in favor of granting to the lower beings of creation a larger share of intelligence than used to be assigned to them. Not many years ago, it was almost universally granted that animals had no soul and no future life, and only a limited instinct in this life, no reasoning powers, and no foreknowledge of approaching death. All these points have of late years been declared to be uncertain. If we deny to animals powers of reflection and knowledge of a necessary death, it is not possible to assent to the statement that an animal can, in its own mind, decide to end its life at any certain time. Some animals, certainly, protest against entering a yard where others have been slaughtered, as if the smell of blood suggested their fate to them. But what we understand as instinct suffices to explain this terror. Birds of prey are known to detect, by sight or smell, when an animal is about to die. This again is the instinct provided to supply them with food. If it be true that a scorpion will sting itself to death when irritated beyond measure, I should be inclined to think that it perishes in its efforts to sting its enemies. Or if not, I should imagine that the action resembles that of a man tearing his hair from anger when he cannot injure his opponent. And the same ideas will apply to the case of the bee, which is similarly said to kill itself in wounding its enemy. Wild birds will refuse food and die if confined in a cage, and the survivor of a pair of tame birds, after the death of his mate, is often noticed to refuse food and rapidly die of exhaustion. But I should explain such cases by saying that the loss had made so intense an impression on the creature's consciousness as to supersede the impulse to feed itself. I myself remember seeing a healthy little dog refuse food, pine away and die, when its young mistress, who had for months hourly petted it, became a mother, and the dog became neglected. Its death was from neglect of a voluntary action, but was it volitional? Renew Elias, in his work on mental alienation, decides against the possibility of the lower animals ever effecting a voluntary death. He says, "Suicide is the most energetic assertion of man's superiority. Why do not animals conceive and execute it? Because their nature is entirely passive. To them the choice of life or death is not given. Man, on the contrary, eminently free and active, is able to extend his energy even as far as self-destruction. Narratives of the death of animals, especially when these have been pets, are apt to be very unreliable from the infusion of sentiment, and many of the anecdotes of suicide of animals which I have investigated have a semi-mythical character. The stories to which I give references would close the controversy as to whether animals ever do or do not commit suicide. i.e., kill themselves with the intention of ending their lives, and not accidentally nor inadvertently, if they could be relied on to possess anything like scientific accuracy. Most of them have been published in newspapers and company, where errors would be liable to suffer correction. Aristotle narrates that a horse, having been induced to have connection with his own dam by the artifice of veiling her, for he had refused to do so previously, on seeing what he had done, jumped intentionally from a cliff and was killed by the fall. See History of Animals, Book 9, Chapter 47. But Professor Axe, of the Royal Veterinary College, tells me that he has never heard of such a refusal on the part of a horse, neither has he ever observed any instance which seemed to him to point to the intentional self-destruction of any animal. There is an old story mentioned in Boswell's Life of Johnson that a scorpion, if irritated by placing it within a ring of burning coals, will thrust its own sting into itself and so commit suicide. Dr. Johnson doubted it and remarked that Morpreti did not credit it. Bory de Saint Vincent, in the classic Dictionnaire d'Histoire Naturelle, Volume 15, says he has tried the experiment and the scorpions simply became suffocated. There is a reference to the suicide of scorpions in Nature, Volume 11, page 29, which speaks of irritating a scorpion by means of a burning glass, with the same result. In the next week's number, page 47, is another mention of a similar observation. At Volume 20, page 553, a writer denies the possibility of a scorpion striking itself, whilst at page 577, Professor Alan Thompson details hearsay instances of scorpions forcibly piercing their own heads by their recurved stings when annoyed by a bright light. Hewitt William V.S. tells the story of an artillery horse which refused food and died from starvation after the death of another horse with which he had long worked. See The Horse. Dr. W. L. Lindsay is a copious writer on this subject. He fully believes in animal suicide and speaks of old age, wounded feelings, pain, desperation, continued ill usage, captivity, and self-sacrifice as causes, and states that he has notes of instances occurring in the dog, horse, mule, camel, llama, ass, monkey, seal and deer, stork, cock, jackdaw, and duck, spider and scorpion. He narrates also some of the cases from which I have given references. See Mind in the Lower Animals. He gives also many very interesting examples of accidental self-destruction, such as the strangling of horses by their halters when endeavoring to escape from a stable, that monkeys have cut their throats from imitating a man shaving, and that mice have been poisoned by eating greenbacks. Some sorts of fish, as salmon, have been noticed to throw themselves out of the water, but it seems very doubtful whether this act is meant to be suicidal. Voluntary deaths of animals during panic and terror and from fascination seem to intervene between accidental suicides and suicides which appear to be the result of choice. Such deaths are caused by the headlong flight of sheep when worried by a dog, or are caused by fires on the prairies, or by fascination, as seen in the case of moths in a candle flame. Other instances of apparent suicide may be consulted, viz. Suicide of dogs by a railway train. See Freeman's Journal, Dublin, 1878. Some fowls by drowning. Sir S. Baker, The Albert Nyanza, 1876. Deer in America. Dr. Pierre Quian, Traité de la Folie, 1839. Storks in conflagrations. Uzo J.C. Etude sur les facultés, 1872. Pike from Payne, Watson, J.S. The Reasoning Power of Animals, 1870. Dog from the Pain of Acedon, Winter. Spider, Gillies, R. On the Habits of Spiders, 1876. Dog by Drowning, Shrewsbury Chronicle, October 25, 1878. Cat by Drowning, Notes and Queries, October 19, 1878. Dog by Drowning, Notes and Queries, June 25, 1884. Horse by Drowning, The Veterinarian, August 1864. Cat by Drowning, Stamford Mercury, August 16, 1878. Horse by Drowning, at Alloa, July 1876. Elk, Sir S. Baker, 8 years in Ceylon, 1874. Dog from Madness, Dr. MacDonald, Times, October 1874. Dog from Pain of a Wound, Dundee Advertiser, 1874. Old Age, Northern Ensign, July 20th, 1870. Norris, Lindsay. Old Age and Pain, Morris, Lindsay. Broken Legs, North British Daily Mail, 1876. Monkey, Forbes, Lindsay. Canvasback Duck, Gilmore P. Prairie and Forest, 1874. End of Suicide of Animals.
Mr. Jefferson's Will by Thomas Jefferson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mr. Jefferson's Will. I, Thomas Jefferson of Monticello and Albemarle, being of sound mind and in my ordinary state of health, make my last will and testament in manner and form as follows. I give to my grandson, Francis Epps, son of my dear deceased daughter, Mary Epps, in fee simple, all that part of my lands at Poplar Forest, lying west of the following lines, to wit, beginning at Radford's upper corner, near the double branches of Bear Creek and the public road, and running thence in a straight line to the fork of my private road, near the barn. Thence, along that private road, as it was changed in 1817, to its crossing of the main branch of North Tomahawk Creek, and from that crossing in a direct line over the main ridge, which divides the North and South Tomahawk, to the South Tomahawk, at the confluence of two branches, where the old road to the Waterlick crossed it, and from that confluence up the northernmost branch, which separate McDaniel's and Perry's fields, to its source, and thence by the shortest line to my western boundary, and having, in a former correspondence with my deceased son-in-law John W. Epps, contemplated laying off for him, with remainder to my grandson Francis, a certain portion in the southern part of my lands in Bedford and Campbell, which I afterwards found to be generally more indifferent than I had supposed, and therefore determined to change its location for the better, now to remove all doubt, if any could arise on a purpose merely voluntary and unexecuted. I hereby declare that what I have herein given to my said grandson Francis is instead of, and not additional to, what I had formerly contemplated. I subject all my other property to the payment of my debts in the first place. Considering the insolvent state of the affairs of my friend and son-in-law Thomas Mann Randolph, and that what will remain of my property will be the only resource against the want in which his family would otherwise be left, it must be his wish, as it is my duty, to guard that resource against all liability for his debts, engagements, or purposes whatsoever, and to preclude the rights, powers, and authorities over it which might result to him by operation of law, and which might, independently of his will, bring it within the power of his creditors. I do hereby devise and bequeath all the residue of my property, real and personal, in possession or in action, whether held in my own right or in that of my dear deceased wife, according to the powers vested in me by deed of settlement for that purpose, to my grandson Thomas J. Randolph and my friends Nicholas P., Trist, and Alexander Garrett, and their heirs, during the life of my said son-in-law Thomas M. Randolph, to be held and administered by them in trust for the sole and separate use and behoof of my dear daughter Martha Randolph and her heirs. And aware of the nice and difficult distinction of the law in these cases, I will further explain by saying that I understand and intend the effect of these limitations to be that the legal estate and actual occupation shall be vested in my said trustees, and held by them in base fee, determinable on the death of my said son-in-law, and the remainder during the same time be vested in my said daughter and her heirs, and of course disposable by her last will, and that at the death of my said son-in-law the particular estate of the trustees shall be determined, and the remainder in legal estate, possession, and use become vested in my said daughter and her heirs in absolute property forever. In consequence of the variety and indescribableness of the articles of property within the house at Monticello, and the difficulty of inventorying and appraising them separately and specifically, and its inutility, I dispense with having them inventoried and appraised, and it is my will that my executors be not held to give any security for the administration of my estate. I appoint my grandson Thomas Jefferson Randolph my sole executor during his life, and after his death I constitute executors my friends Nicholas P. Trist and Alexander Garrett, joining to them my daughter Martha Randolph after the death of my said son-in-law Thomas M. Randolph. Lastly, I revoke all former wills by me heretofore made, and in witness that this is my will, I have written the whole with my own hand on 2 pages, and have subscribed my name to each of them the 16th day of March, 1826. I, Thomas Jefferson of Monticello and Albemarle, make and add the following codicil to my will, controlling the same so far as its provisions go. I recommend to my daughter Martha Randolph the maintenance and care of my well-beloved sister Anne Scott, and trust confidently that from affection to her, as well as for my sake, she will never let her want a comfort. I have made no specific provision for the comfortable maintenance of my son-in-law Thomas M. Randolph because of the difficulty and uncertainty of devising terms which shall vest any beneficial interest in him, which the law will not transfer to the benefit of his creditors, to the destitution of my daughter and her family, and disablement of her to supply him, whereas property placed under the exclusive control of my daughter and her independent will, as if she were a femme sole, considering the relation in which she stands both to him and his children, will be a certain resource against want for all. I give to my friend James Madison of Montpelier my gold-mounted walking staff of animal horn, as a token of the cordial and affectionate friendship which for nearly now and half century has united us in the same principles and pursuits of what we have deemed for the greatest good of our country. I give to the University of Virginia my library, except such particular books only, and of the same edition, as it may already possess. When this legacy shall take effect, the rest of my said library, remaining after those given to the university, shall have been taken out. I give to my 2 grandsons-in-law, Nicholas P. Trist and Joseph Coolidge. To my grandson Thomas Jefferson Randolph, I give my silver watch in preference of the golden one because of its superior excellence. My papers of business going of course to him as my executor, all others of a literary or other character I give to him as of his own property. I give a gold watch to each of my grandchildren, who shall not have already received one from me, to be purchased and delivered by my executor to my grandsons at the age of 21, and granddaughters at that of 16. I give to my good, affectionate, and faithful servant Burwell his freedom, and the sum of $300 to buy necessaries to commence his trade of glazier, or to use otherwise as he pleases. I give also to my good servants, John Hemmings and Joe Fawcett, their freedom at the end of 1 year after my death, and to each of them respectively all the tools of their respective shops or callings, and it is my will that a comfortable log house be built for each of the 3 servants so emancipated, on some part of my lands convenient to them, with respect to the residence of their wives, and to Charlottesville and the university, where they will be mostly employed, and reasonably convenient also to the interests of the proprietor of the lands, of which houses I give the use of 1, with a curtilage of 1 acre to each, during his life or personal occupation thereof. I give also to John Hemmings the service of his 2 apprentices, Madison and Eston Hemmings, until their respective ages of 21 years, at which period, respectively, I give them their freedom. And I humbly and earnestly request of the legislature of Virginia a confirmation of the bequest of freedom to these servants, with permission to remain in this state where their families and connections are, as an additional instance of the favor of which I have received so many other manifestations in the course of my life, and for which I now give them my last solemn and dutiful thanks. In testimony that this is a codicil to my will of yesterday's date, and that it is to modify so far the provisions of that will, I have written it all with my own hand in 2 pages, to each of which I subscribe my name, the 17th day of March, 1826. End of Mr. Jefferson's Will, by Thomas Jefferson.